Part 6. Back Home. Chapter 18. The last chapter. Citizen Truman. Been going over a book on what former presidents did in times past. Maybe I can get some ideas. Truman to Dean Acheson, April 1953. 1. For as far back nearly as he could remember, Truman had held to the ideal of the mythical Roman hero Cincinnatus, the patriot farmer who assumes command in his country's hour of peril, then returns to the plow. Who knows, maybe I'll be like Cincinnatus and be elected constable someday, the farmer from Grandview had written long ago to Bessie Wallace. It was an ideal upon which the nation had been founded. Truman and Dwight Eisenhower, in their inaugural procession through the rotunda of the Capitol, had passed by John Trumbull's immense painting of George Washington as Cincinnatus. Washington resigning his commission to the Congress as Commander-in-Chief of the Army, Washington, farmer and hero, turning away from power in 1783. Now, in 1953, having become considerably more than constable, having turned by his own choice from the most power ever vested in a single human being in all history until then, Truman would note in his diary that Cincinnatus knew not only when, but how to lay down power. It was the common belief in America, Truman wrote, that anyone could become president, and then when the time was up, go back to being just anybody again. Recalling his years in the White House, he would say, "I tried never to forget who I was and where I'd come from and where I would go back to." In actual practice, however, it was not so simple. A cartoon in the Saturday Review showed a small boy with glasses and a book under his arm, a boy very like Truman had been, walking beside a friend who said, "Okay, so you grow up to be president, and you even get re-elected. That's still only 8 years. What do you do with the rest of your life?" With his pen, Truman scrawled boldly across the bottom, "God only knows." He had traveled home from Washington unprotected by Secret Service agents, and there were to be none watching over him. He had come home without salary or pension. He had no income or support of any kind from the federal government, other than his Army pension of $112.56 a month. He was provided with no government funds for secretarial help or office space, not a penny of expense money, and while he and Bess had managed to put aside part of his $100,000 a year salary as president during his second term, primarily in government bonds, it was in all probability a modest amount. Estimates at the time ranged as high as $250,000, but there was no evidence to support such a figure or any sum. In fact, it is known that Truman had been forced to take out a loan at the National Bank in Washington in his last weeks as president to tide him over, though the amount was never disclosed. With his brother and sister, he had inherited Martha Ellen Truman's farmland at Grandview, and while official disposition of the old house at 219 North Delaware had yet to be made, he and Bess would soon become joint owners. Certainly as things were, there could be no extravagant living. In effect, they were land-rich only. The estate of the supposedly well-to-do Madge Wallace, not including the house, totaled all of $33,543.60, which, after being divided 4 ways among Bess and her brothers, left Bess with a cash inheritance of $8,385.90. Indeed, among the reasons why they had come back to independence in the old house was that financially they had little other choice. The town buzzed with speculation over where the Trumans might live now, whether they would stay on in the old Wallace place, which to many seemed unlikely for someone who had been President of the United States. "Rumors have it that they will buy a fine home and live in Kansas City," wrote Sue Gentry in the Examiner. Other rumors predict they will build a home on farmland Mr. Truman owns at Grandview, a part of his old home place. A local attorney and old friend of the family, Rufus Burris, had picked out an elegant house in a new section of town that he thought perfect, much more suitable for a former president. But all such talk was beside the point, finances notwithstanding. The Trumans had no intention of living anywhere else, no interest in living somewhere warmer or less expensive or more glamorous. Herbert Hoover, the country's one other surviving former president, was a man of wealth who lived in style at the Waldorf Towers in New York. Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, Woodrow Wilson, none of those who had faced the prospect of being a former president since the start of the century had had worries about money. None but Calvin Coolidge, who, downcast over the death of a son and in poor health, lived less than 3 years after leaving office. Theodore Roosevelt had gone storming off to Africa to hunt big game. Taft became a professor of law at Yale, then Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Wilson, with his wealthy second wife, retired in style to a 22-room house on S Street in Washington and lived a few more years in semi-seclusion. For his part, Truman had neither wealth to sustain him nor any particular prospects at the moment, no plans for future employment. His only intention, as he said, was to do nothing, accept no position, lend his name to no organization or transaction that would exploit or commercialize the prestige and dignity of the office of the President. He had had a number of offers already from undisclosed organizations for jobs paying $100,000 a year or more and calling for little commitment of his time. A letter from a Miami real estate developer inviting him to become chairman, officer, or stockholder at a figure of not less than $100,000 would turn up later in his files, but what the other propositions were is not clear, though none apparently was from a corporation or organization of particular renown. In any event, he had turned them all down and would continue to do so. His name was not for sale. He would take no fees for commercial endorsements or for lobbying or writing letters or making phone calls. He would accept no consulting fees, nor any gifts that might appear as a product endorsement on his part. Offered a new Toyota by Toyota's American public relations firm as a demonstration of improved good feelings between Japan and America, he flatly refused. Moreover, he wrote in response, there was no possibility of his ever driving a foreign car of any make. He believed in driving cars made in America. He liked to say he was just a plain American citizen again. It confirmed his democratic philosophy. It pleased people and pleased him. But the difficulties in practice were more than he had anticipated. I still don't feel like a completely private citizen, and I don't suppose I ever will, he told a reporter. It's still almost impossible to do as other people do, even though I've tried. You can't always be as you want to be after you've been under those bright lights. Further, he missed the bright lights. He missed the pace of the presidency, felt strange without the constant pressures. He missed the people terribly. In thanking Dean Acheson for the farewell luncheon, he wrote that he had never been to such a party where everybody seemed to be having the best time they ever had. Then he added, I hope we will never lose contact. The cheering throng that welcomed the Trumans home at the Independence Depot the night of their return exceeded all expectations. Perhaps 10,000 people were waiting in the cold when the train came round the bend at 9:03, an hour late because of other crowds at earlier stops across Missouri. Truman was astonished, overjoyed. Well, Harry, this makes it all worth it, Bess said to him. They had arrived the night of Wednesday, January 21st. The morning after, asked by NBC correspondent Ray Scherer what was the first thing he planned to do, Truman said he was going to carry the grips up to the attic, a remark that would become famous. Scherer, like Tony Vaccaro of the Associated Press, had accompanied Truman from Washington on the train, as had Roger Tubby. But in another hour, Truman was on his way out the door, heading downtown to Kansas City in a state highway patrol car, riding up front with Sergeant Art Bell, a former Battery D boy who had been assigned by the governor as a temporary driver. Truman went to see his new offices, 4 corner rooms on the 11th floor of the Federal Reserve Bank building at 10th and Grand. The faithful Rose Conway was already on duty, sorting through several thousand letters, mostly expressions of praise and gratitude, all of which Truman felt obliged to answer. There was no official welcome in Kansas City, but this seemed to bother him not at all. When, with Roger Tubby, he walked 5 blocks to the Mulebach for lunch with his brother Vivian, and few passers-by took notice, Truman kept on smiling and talking as though all were perfectly fine. The following day the weather turned foul, with a sudden drop in temperature, down to the 20s, accompanied by a biting north wind, sleet, and snow. Ignoring the weather, Truman set off for Grandview to look over the site for the library he planned to build. Roger Tubby had arranged for some of the local press to join him, and the group made a memorable picture. The old president, his collar up against the wind, tramping across the snow-covered fields, talking rapidly of his childhood and of his $1,500,000 project and what it would mean to the young students who will take over the destiny of our country, while a half-dozen reporters, his former White House press secretary, and one-time comrade-in-arms Sergeant Bell in his state police uniform, all tried their best to keep up and stay warm. The library was the big interest now. Truman's papers, for the time being, were stored at the county courthouse in Kansas City. Since the time of George Washington, it had been commonly understood that a president's papers were his own personal property, and that he was free to do with them as he wished. The Franklin Roosevelt Library had been established at Hyde Park, New York, the first so-called presidential library, on the grounds of the Roosevelt estate on the Hudson, but Roosevelt had not lived to take part in the project. Truman, before leaving office, had sent George Elsie out from Washington to look over the farm with his brother Vivian and architect Edward Neild. Vivian had led them to the spot where he thought the library ought to go, a low-lying, swampy corner close to the railroad tracks. When Elsie and Neild pointed to a more attractive site on a high-rise with views in all directions, Vivian objected. That was good land, Vivian said, and he saw no reason to waste good land on any old dang library. Truman had already made some sketches. He wanted the building to look like his grandfather Solomon Young's house, the big house of his own childhood memories. Truman had made a rough drawing of the house as best he could remember it. "A cold wind whipping around us," Roger Tubby would record in his diary, and he talks of the library. "This America of ours, we look out over the prairies, envision cities or universities, and lo, they arise." The former president, reported the Examiner, seemed to enjoy the brisk weather. A few days later, on a Sunday, he set off early, before it was fully light, on his first walk through town, free of Sergeant Bell or bodyguards of any kind for the first time in more than 7 years. He covered some 15 blocks, rounding Jackson Square en route, and nothing he had done thus far, he later wrote, had given such a striking sense of being on his own at last. "More than any other single thing, this marked the abrupt change in my life." Speaking at a huge welcome-home banquet at the auditorium of the reorganized Latter-day Saints, Truman said simply and from the heart, "There never is and never can be anything like coming back home." He bought Bess a new car, a four-door black Chrysler with white-ball tires, and started driving himself again. As sightseers and the curious kept coming around the house almost daily, he decided not to have the iron fence taken down. Often whole delegations, Girl Scouts, tourists, stood outside looking through the fence. "Is this where Truman lives?" a man called to him at 7 one morning from a car at the curb. He kept to the routine of the morning walks, kept up with the mail pouring into the office in Kansas City, 72,000 pieces in the first 2 weeks alone. He refused to be idle. His name was painted in black block letters on the door marked 1107. He arrived regularly before 9 each morning. Nearly anyone who wished could come into the office to shake hands with him or visit. As he told a friend, "You don't need an appointment to see me now." Yet he was worse than alone, his friend Tom Evans would remember. He was utterly lost. After all those years in the White House with somebody around to do everything for him, he didn't know how to order a meal in a restaurant. He didn't know when to tip. He didn't even know how to call a cab and pay for it. But as Evans also remembered, Truman never said a word of complaint. At home, the house seemed quiet and too big, with only Bess and Vieta Gar, who went to her own home after dinner. Every night he and Bess would call Margaret in New York. By early February, less than a month since the return, it began to look as though their financial worries were over. He was about to sign a book contract for a fantastic sum, Truman wrote to Atchison, and on February 12th the press reported that he had sold the exclusive worldwide rights to his memoirs to Life magazine for an undisclosed amount. In fact, the figure was $600,000, truly a fantastic sum in 1953, which, by a contract negotiated for him by Sam Rosenman, was to be paid in installments over 5 years. At the end of March, he, Bess, and Margaret went off on a dream vacation trip to Hawaii, traveling first to San Francisco as the guests of Averill Harriman in his private railroad car. From San Francisco, they sailed on the President Cleveland, of the American President's Line, down the bay and out under the Golden Gate Bridge. Of the morning they arrived off Oahu, Truman wrote, "Diamond Head and then Honolulu, with the Pali in the background, rainbows, clouds, sunshine, and a beautiful city all in one scene." It was one of the most enchanting experiences of their lives. Hawaii was paradise, and they stayed a month as the guests of Ed Pauley at his estate on Little Coconut Island, in Kaneohe Bay, on the windward side of Oahu. Long a champion of statehood for the islands, Truman was given an effusive Hawaiian welcome from the moment the ship landed. Government and military officials, the press, a dozen different reception committees rushed on board to escort him ashore. They covered us with leis and smothered us with questions and flashbulbs. He accepted an honorary degree at the University of Hawaii, toured Oahu, and on a flying visit to the big island of Hawaii in a Navy C-47, soared over the saddle between the snow-capped volcanoes, Mauna Kea and Mauna Loa. When on the return flight to Oahu, he spotted a school of whales off Maui, the Navy pilots told him it meant good luck. He swam, loafed, read, and thoroughly enjoyed the wonderful people of the islands. And then the month was over, and he was home again at North Delaware Street, where the house was still quiet and too big. He bought another car, this one for himself, a two-tone green Dodge Coupe, to drive to his office. He loved cars no less than ever and was as fussy as ever about their appearance. "This morning at 7 a.m. I took off for my morning walk," begins a diary entry from that spring. "I just had the Dodge car washed a day or so ago, and it looked as if it had never been used. The weatherman said it would rain, so I decided to put the washed car in the garage and use the black car, which was already spotted and dusty. My sister-in-law, watching me make the change, which required some maneuvering due to the location of several cars in the driveway, wanted to know if I might be practicing for a job in a parking station." He knew he must get started on his memoirs, but dreaded the prospect. Hawaii had made him lazy as hell. He wished he had never agreed to do the book. On his walk that same spring morning, he stopped to watch a construction project, the widening of Truman Road. A shovel, automatic, and a drag line were working, as well as some laboring men digging in the old-fashioned way. The boss of the contractor was looking on, and I asked him if he didn't need a good straw boss. He took a look at me and then watched the work a while and then took another look and broke out in a broad smile and said, "Oh, yes, you are out of a job, aren't you?" He felt a constant need to be on the move. So in the heat of June, he and Bess started for Washington in the new Chrysler. He wanted to give the car a real tryout, he said. Bess was delighted. Friends and family tried to talk them out of going. He and Bess had not traveled on their own by automobile in 9 years, not since their return from the Chicago Convention in 1944. Yet off they went, making an early start, Truman at the wheel. "Wasn't it good to be on their own again?" she said. They got as far as Hannibal before stopping for lunch at a roadside restaurant, only to find how difficult being on their own was going to be. As Truman later wrote to his old Army friend, Vic Householder, "Everything went well until a couple of old-time county judges came in and saw me. They said, 'Why, there's Judge Truman,' and then every waitress and all the customers had to shake hands and have autographs." At Decatur, Illinois, 150 miles later, Truman pulled into a Shell station where he had often stopped for gas in years past, traveling to and from Washington. An elderly attendant who kept studying him while filling the tank finally inquired if he wasn't Senator Truman. "I admitted the charge," Truman continued in his letter to Householder, "and asked him if he could direct me to a good motel in town. We'd never stayed at one and wanted to try it out and see if we liked it. Well, he directed us, but he told everybody in town about it. The chief of police got worried about us and sent 2 plainclothes men and 4 uniformed police to look after us. They took us to dinner and to breakfast the next morning and escorted us out of town with a sigh of relief." Bess insisted he keep to the 50-mile-an-hour speed limit, but going so slowly, as he said, meant others passing had a chance to look them over. "Hi, Harry," people shouted as they went by. "There goes our incognito," he told her. At the hotel where they stopped in Wheeling, West Virginia, the lobby was jammed with reporters and photographers. But there was no doubt that he loved the attention. When at Frederick, Maryland, he saw several familiar faces from the Washington Press Corps waiting in a car to escort him into the city, he greeted them like long-lost brothers. "You're a sight for sore eyes," he exclaimed. Pulling up at the Mayflower Hotel, he stepped from the car in his shirt sleeves to be immediately surrounded by a crowd of more reporters and photographers and hotel employees, all trying to shake his hand. He was there only to have a good time, he said, his face beaming in the late afternoon sunshine. Carefree as a schoolboy in summer, according to the account in the Post the next morning. To all questions concerning Congress, the President, the Korean War, Truman said, "No comment, no comment, no comment." A steady stream of old friends, members of his cabinet, Democratic senators, members of Congress, came to call. It was like a dream, Truman later wrote. The suite we stayed in at the Mayflower could have been the White House. Everything seemed just as it used to be, the taxi drivers shouting hello along the line of my morning walks, the dinners at night with the men and women I'd worked with for years, the conferences, the tension, the excitement, the feeling of things happening and going to happen. And the good time continued over the next weekend when he and Bess drove on to New York and checked in at the Waldorf Astoria. With Margaret, they dined at the 21 Club and saw Leonard Bernstein's Wonderful Town at the Winter Garden. As they came into the theater, the whole audience rose and applauded. Cab drivers in New York did not just call to him, they pulled to the curb and jumped out to shake his hand. He was still their man, he was assured. "If you'd go again tomorrow, Harry, you'd win." Heading home from Missouri, perking along on the Pennsylvania Turnpike, Truman was signaled to pull over by the police. According to what State Trooper Manley Stampler told reporters, Mr. Truman had twice cut in front of vehicles trying to pass him. He was very nice about it and promised to be more careful. But according to Truman, who had never had a traffic violation, the young man had only wanted to shake hands. It was his last venture with Bess on their own by automobile. Thereafter they would go by train, plane, or ship. On March 5th, in Moscow, after nearly 3 decades in power, Joseph Stalin had died of a cerebral hemorrhage at age 73. 10 days later, Stalin's successor, Georgy Malenkov, declared in a speech that there was no issue between Moscow and Washington that could not be resolved by peaceful means. 2 weeks after Malenkov's speech, the communists in Korea suddenly agreed to an exchange of wounded prisoners and said that this should lead to a peaceful settlement of the entire prisoner issue. Then in the final week of July, as Truman, in the heat of high summer in Missouri, was beginning to work on his memoirs, an armistice was signed at Panmunjom. The Korean War was over. It was an armistice with voluntary reparation, and the dividing line between North and South Korea was to remain the 38th parallel. So President Eisenhower had achieved essentially the very same settlement that had eluded Truman, a no-win agreement, as Truman's Republican critics would have called it. As Senator Paul Douglas observed, Truman would have been flayed from one end of Washington to the other if he had accepted the present agreement. Stalin's death had unquestionably had an effect. So also had Eisenhower's threats to use newly developed tactical nuclear weapons in Korea. The war had caused terrible bloodshed and destruction, perhaps as many as 2 million civilian dead according to some estimates, 4 million casualties overall. The Americans killed in battle numbered 33,629, and another 20,617 Americans died of other causes. To many Americans at home, it seemed the war had resolved nothing, but to Truman, as to a great many others, it was a major victory for the United States and the United Nations. Military aggression had been stopped. The communist advance in Asia had been checked. South Korea and possibly Japan as well had been saved from what had seemed an inexorable red tide. The United Nations had been shown to be something more than a world debating society. As for the United States, wrote the New York Times, the action in Korea represented something of a regaining of our national soul and conscience. We did a difficult and costly thing because we thought it was right. Asked for his opinion about the armistice settlement, Eisenhower said simply, "The war is over, and I hope my son is coming home soon." Truman said nothing for attribution. Though undoubtedly and understandably resentful that his successor had achieved what he himself had failed to attain, and without resulting political rancor, he kept silent. Privately, he thanked God it was ended. "Of course I'm happy about the truce in Korea," he wrote to a friend. "It doesn't make any difference about the credit for holding back Soviet aggression. The fact that the shooting has stopped is a very satisfactory one." The following October, when Eisenhower came to Kansas City for a speech to the future farmers of America, and was staying at the Mulebach, Truman tried to reach him at the hotel by phone to say he would like to drop by to pay his respects, but was told by an aide that the president's schedule was too full, a meeting would be impossible. Truman was shattered. In explanation, Eisenhower's office later said that whoever answered the phone must have thought it was a crank call. 2. With the task of the memoirs that he had been putting off finally underway, and with his efforts to launch the library, Truman found himself more occupied than he had ever anticipated. "The book is doing fine, but what a slave it's made of me," he would report to Dean Acheson in the fall. Of all the presidents until then, only Herbert Hoover had written his own story in his lifetime. "How much is lost to us because so few presidents have told their own stories," Truman was to say in the preface to his own work. John Quincy Adams and James K. Polk had written extensively about their time in office, but in their private diaries. Ulysses S. Grant, dying of cancer, had spent his final days laboring heroically on his memoirs as a means to provide financial security for his family, but Grant chose not to include his shadowed years in the White House. Even Theodore Roosevelt, with his sense of history and of his own importance to history, was oddly superficial when describing his presidency in his popular autobiography. Nor had Herbert Hoover, in telling his story, been obliged to recount anything approaching the world-shaking tumult, the watershed history of the Truman years. The closest thing to what Truman would be attempting was Winston Churchill's magisterial history of World War II, which had also appeared first in Life, and against which, as Truman knew, whatever he produced was bound to be compared. "I'm not a writer," those working with him on the project were to hear him say many times. He was not after their sympathy, only stating what he saw as the heart of the problem. Before the task was finished, a full dozen people would be involved. The first called in to help were William Hillman and David Noyes, both of whom had served on the White House staff as speechwriters, and whose loyalty to Truman verged on adoration. Hillman, a hulking veteran newspaper correspondent, had already published a eulogizing Truman portrait called Mr. President, a book of photographs with text compiled mainly from Truman quotes and selections from his private papers. Noyes was in advertising in California, a short, wiry, talkative man who had worked on the 1948 campaign and was best known for initiating the controversial scheme to send Chief Justice Vinson to Moscow. His claim to have been one of Truman's key advisers was greatly exaggerated. Promising to protect Truman from the publisher, Hillman and Noyes set up a working procedure for the memoirs. They offered advice, and they came and went, flying in and out of Kansas City as need be every month or so, while a paid staff of 3 was established in room 1002, on the floor below Truman at the Federal Reserve Bank building. The plan was for Truman to talk the book. For months he talked to a recording machine supplied by Life, a device he hated, responding to questions put to him by the hour by a University of Southern California professor of journalism named Robert E.G. Harris. Meantime, 2 young research assistants checked all that Truman said against what was in the files. By late fall, more than 100,000 words had been transcribed, all beautifully typed and arranged in loose-leaf notebooks. But there was very little in the way of an actual manuscript, and what Truman saw of this he didn't like. "Good God, what crap," he scrawled across the top. Professor Harris was dismissed, his place taken by another academic scholar, Morton Royce, a highly disorganized, excessively profane man who continued on with the interviews, but ever so slowly, pressing Truman over and over for more complete and detailed answers, often returning to the same questions several times, and particularly about the atomic bomb. As a consequence, Truman grew extremely annoyed with Royce and the whole process. The editor of Life, Ed Thompson, flew in from New York for a first look early in 1954. Truman had agreed to deliver 300,000 words by June 30th, 1955. As it was, perhaps 35 pages of manuscript were ready. The raw material, Truman's own recollections, Thompson thought lively and honest, but far greater progress was needed, and soon. Morton Royce departed, and 2 new writers were taken on, young Herbert Lee Williams, a doctoral candidate from the University of Missouri, and Francis H. Heller, an associate professor of political science at the University of Kansas. Williams would remember being astonished by the volume of official and private papers at hand. The cream of the White House communications mix from 1945 to 1952 had been systematically ladled into 50 large metal file cabinets which now lined the walls of the 11th floor suite, Truman's offices upstairs. In these were all of the personal and official correspondence of the president, transcripts of 2,003 public speeches and 324 press conferences, a multitude of interoffice memoranda and directives, minutes of countless executive sessions, copies of more than 31,000 dictated letters, plus handwritten notes to Mama or Sister Mary. The first bundle of files I was given to take down to 1002, where I was to digest the contents and regurgitate them in memoirs form, covered the entire Lend-Lease story, from the time that Truman inherited it from FDR. Entering Truman's office one morning in search of a reference book, Williams was also astonished to find the former president fixing himself a drink. As Williams strongly disapproved of drinking, he would, as time went on, decline invitations to join Truman for lunch, which customarily began with a little H2O flavored with bourbon, as Truman would say. As manuscript chapters began to emerge, they were reviewed page by page during lengthy sessions in Truman's office, a good-sized room comfortably furnished with leather chairs, a flag, portraits of Jackson and Jefferson, and books across one wall. The windows faced west over a panoramic view of the city and the distant hills of Kansas. As someone on the staff read aloud, Truman would sit listening intently. His approval or criticism was solicited almost paragraph by paragraph. The whole idea was to jog the memory of the man who had been there, to add the auto to the biography, Williams would recall, in an article somewhat vainly and inaccurately titled, "I Was Truman's Ghost." In fact, he was only a minor ghost among the several enlisted, and his participation was to be relatively brief. As time went on, various members of Truman's White House staff, as well as Dean Acheson, John Snyder, General Bradley, and others of Truman's cabinet, would come to Kansas City to take part in these review sessions. The man who had been rising early and going off to work every morning most of his long life had by now settled again into the old pattern. At the house on North Delaware, the lights started coming on well before dawn, usually at 5:30, at the sound of the courthouse clock. His morning paper, the Kansas City Times, arrived shortly afterward, tossed over the iron fence from a passing car, and he would unlatch the front door and come down the porch steps in his shirt sleeves to retrieve the paper from the front walk. About 7 he would emerge again from the front door, in suit jacket and hat now, a walking cane in hand. He would go out the front gate, in turn unlocking, closing, and checking to see it was secure, then start off on his walk, a half-hour tour that took him through the same neighborhood, over much the same ground in memory that he was covering in the memoirs. Across the street still was the little Victorian Noland house, occupied still by his Noland cousins, Ethel and Nellie. Rounding the corner from North Delaware, left onto Maple and heading east, uptown to the square, he would pass the red-brick First Presbyterian Church where he and Bess had met in Sunday school. She had golden curls and has, to this day, the most beautiful eyes, he was saying in the memoirs. At the square, Clinton's drugstore was now Hellsberg Jewelers, but looked not greatly different from when he had worked there so diligently as a boy. Mopping the floors, sweeping the sidewalk, and having everything ship-shape when Mr. Clinton came in. The courthouse, the new courthouse, as his generation still called it, his courthouse, held sway over the square no less than ever, its white cupola catching the morning sun ahead of the rest of the town. Tourists would ask which was his office, which were his windows. The judges of these Missouri county courts are not judges in the usual sense, since the court is an administrative, not a judicial body. The town had greatly changed in the 2 decades since he had first gone to Washington. The town was still changing, growing. New sections of new houses seemed to spring up overnight. Traffic was heavier. The population was now past 40,000, more than 5 times what it had been when he was a boy. More and more, Independence was becoming a suburb of Kansas City. Yet the old part of town, the square, the neighborhoods of his boyhood, looked much like they always had, and he felt great affection for all of it. Others who were up and about early often made an effort to say hello, to introduce themselves and shake his hand as he came down the sidewalk at his steady clip. "I always try to be as pleasant as I can," he wrote in his diary. "They, of course, don't know that I walk early to get a chance to think over things and get ready for work of the day." If he didn't know them, he usually knew something about someone they were related to or descended from, and these recollections always pleased him. "Well, I went to Maple Avenue, turned left toward town and spoke to several people, turned south on Pleasant Street," continues the diary account of one such morning. "After I'd passed the light at Lexington, I met a young man, Frank A. Reynolds, who introduced himself as John Struther's son-in-law. We talked a few minutes, and I thought of the Struther family, one of the best old families in the county. John was Democratic committeeman from Blue Township, Independence, from the time I was road overseer in Washington Township until I went to Washington as U.S. Senator from Missouri. He was a grand man, but wouldn't tell his age. He was my father's generation, and he always wanted to be young with the young men. He was a good lawyer and an honest one, too. Just as I started to leave Mr. Struther's son-in-law, and there were other great Struthers, Sam, who was a pillar of the Democratic Party in Kansas City, a second-generation judge, Duval, and many others. As I say, just as I started to walk again, a car stopped across the street, and the man jumped out and came over to shake hands and said, 'I'm sure you can't remember me. It's been so long since you've seen me.' I did, though. I told him whose son he is and who his grandfather was. Some feat for a man who has met millions of people. He belonged to the Pugh family. His grandfather, Noah E. Pugh, was one fine man. He came out to Missouri in 1894 or 1895 and settled on my mother's part of her father's estate, 160 acres southeast of the farm, about 3 miles. Mr. Pugh had several sons and daughters older and younger than I. Conley Pugh was a few years older than I, and was married to a nice Grandview girl when they were very young. It was a happy marriage, and the man who stopped me is Conley's oldest boy. He told me he had 4 children. It is remarkable indeed how time flies and makes you an old man whether you want to be or not. His mother had never looked back, always forward, he liked to remind himself. It was part of her strength. With the work on his memoirs and these daily tours through the old neighborhoods now after so many years, he was thinking more than ever of both parents. He varied his route one day to another, but it hardly mattered. Whichever way he went was a walk through the past. The boyhood home at River and Waldo was still standing, as was the old house on South Chrysler near the depot. When we moved to Independence in December 1890, my father bought a big house on South Chrysler Street with several acres of land. There was to be only one chapter about his early life, taking him from boyhood to his return from France in 1919, but it was a part of the story only he could tell, for which there were no file drawers to search, and the words would be his. In the fall of 1892, Grover Cleveland was re-elected over Benjamin Harrison, who had defeated him in 1888. My father was very much elated by Cleveland's victory. He rode a beautiful gray horse in the torchlight parade and decorated the weather vane on the tower at the northeast corner of the house with a flag and bunting. The weather vane was a beautiful gilded rooster. Once at the White House, a magazine writer had remarked to him that his father had been a failure. How could he be called a failure, he had answered, if his son became President of the United States? During the half-hour or so that he was gone from the house, at about 7:15, Vieta Gar would arrive by taxi at the side gate to begin fixing breakfast. The schedule rarely varied. He would return through the front gate at 7:30, not to re-emerge until roughly 8:15, but from the back porch this time and carrying an aluminum briefcase with the manuscript pages he had brought home the night before. He would head for the garage. Then the two-tone green Dodge would be seen backing cautiously out the driveway, and off he would go, west down Truman Road, the Kansas City skyline dead ahead, and on sunny mornings shining like an artist's picture of America on the rise. His regular parking space was in an open lot a block from the office. He would pay $1 in advance and walk to the bank building. Entering in the lobby, he would tip his hat to the elevator operator, Kay Walker, and greet her by name. By 8:45, he was at his desk. "I have been working on the opening chapter of my purported memoirs," Truman wrote to Dean Acheson from the office on January 28, 1954, trying to get to the bottom of why he found the task so very difficult. "I have tried to place myself back into the position I was on April 12, 1945. I've read letters to my mother and sister, to my brother and cousins. I've read telegrams to and from Churchill and Roosevelt, to and from Stalin and Roosevelt. I've read memos I made of visits to the White House from April 12th back to July 1944. I've read Ike's, Leahy's, Churchill's, Grew's, Cordell Hull's books, memos from Hopkins, Stimson, Assistant and Acting Secretary of State Dean Acheson, reports from Marshall, Eisenhower, King, Bradley, communiques of Tehran, Cairo, Casablanca, Quebec, Yalta, Burns's book on it, etc., ad lib, and still I am living today. So you see, the past has always interested me for use in the present, and I'm bored to death with what I did and didn't do 9 years ago. But Andrew Johnson, James Madison, even old Rutherford B. Hayes I'm extremely interested in, as I am in King Henry IV of France, Margaret of Navarre, Charles V and Philip II of Spain, and Charlie's Aunt Margaret. Wish to goodness I'd decided to spend my so-called retirement putting Louis XIII, Gustavus Adolphus, Richelieu, and 5 tubs of gold together instead of writing about me and my mistakes." On St. Patrick's Day, he wrote again to tell Acheson he was thinking still about the relationship between history and government. "Our tribal instinct has not been eliminated by science and invention. We as individuals haven't caught up physically or ethically with the atomic age. Will we? Perhaps their grandchildren would do better, though, he added, in his case this remained a hypothetical statement. Margaret as yet had shown no signs of getting married. He sensed a change in how the country regarded him and was heartened by it. "The tone of my mail has changed completely. It still comes in by the bushel, but there's hardly a mean one in 200. The increase in interest and appreciation at home in Independence was even more striking. Automobiles and sightseeing buses now cruised slowly by on North Delaware nearly all day. When Bess sent some of his clothes to her church rummage sale, word spread that one item, an overcoat, had been worn at Potsdam, A silly claim, since the meeting at Potsdam had taken place in midsummer, but the coat brought a big price just the same. A sign at the depot now proclaimed, "Independence, the home of Harry S. Truman, 33rd President of the United States." A sign that annoyed Truman, who, with his concern for historical accuracy, insisted he was the 32nd president since Cleveland served twice. Some people in town, mainly among Republicans, thought no better of him than they had before, but they were a decided minority. By strong consensus, the town thought it wonderful that the Trumans were home to stay. People liked the way they had both stepped modestly back into the life of the town, and especially the way Mr. Truman conducted himself as a fellow citizen. They were as proud of him for his lack of side, his fundamental small-town genuineness after all, as they were of anything about him. I used to say that Harry Truman lived around the corner from me, his old friend and ardent Republican, Henry Bundschuh, told a magazine writer from the East. Now there isn't a day goes by that I don't tell myself that you live around the corner from Harry Truman, and don't you forget it. Largest and most generous of the town's gestures, and much the most appreciated by Truman, was the donation of a town park north of the square as a site for his library. He could not have been more pleased. Independence would be a far more appropriate location than Grandview, and more accessible. Slover Park, a quiet, picturesque 13-acre knoll, was just beyond U.S. Highway 24. To have turned over a comparable portion of the Grandview farm, furthermore, would have meant a major financial sacrifice, not only for Truman, but Vivian and Mary Jane, for the land at Grandview was becoming more valuable all the time. Also, the Independence site was only a mile from 219 North Delaware, nothing at all for a good walker. All partisanship and selfishness were left behind months ago, and this home city of this world-famous statesman is the most logical place to establish such a national shrine as the Harry S. Truman Library, wrote the Kansas City Times. Besides the work on the memoirs, Truman threw himself into raising money for the library, attending dinners, making speeches around the country, and writing thousands of letters. A fundraising auction for the library at the National Guard Armory in Independence went on for 7 hours. The government in Washington was to contribute nothing to the cost of creating the library. He would raise all the money himself. It was another campaign for him, and in a year and a half he would build a fund of more than $1 million. The pace, he said, absolutely terrified me, Margaret would remember. Past the age of 70, Truman often said, one was living on borrowed time. Yet in the spring of 1954, turning 70, he gave no sign of exerting or enjoying himself any less than ever. He was putting in 17-hour days on a book, the mail, and seeing the customers who came by the office, he reported to Atchison on May 28th. Nor was that all on his mind. "I'm worried about our world situation. We are losing all our friends. The smart but inexperienced boys at the White House are upsetting NATO and throwing our military strength away. Yet they seem to want to intervene in Indochina." In June, when the Irving Berlin hit musical Call Me Madam, about Pearl Mesta, came to Kansas City's outdoor theater, Truman happily agreed to make a surprise appearance in the last act, playing the part of himself. Waiting backstage the night of June 18th, he was suddenly ill with violent pains in his stomach. Bess rushed him home, and the lights were on at the house all night. On June 20th, in an emergency operation at Research Hospital, he had his gallbladder and appendix removed by Wallace Graham, who, since leaving the White House, had resettled in Kansas City to practice surgery. Infection set in. Graham grimly reported that due to an unusual hypersensitivity to modern drugs, the former president was in serious condition. For several days there was extreme concern. "It was a hell of a time," Truman later said. "They gave me about 5 or 10 gallons of antibiotics by sticking needles in veins, but they just couldn't kill me." But the crisis passed, and Truman, improving rapidly, was the model patient. Nothing seemed to bother him. Western Missouri was in the grip of a fierce heat wave. By midday, thermometers outside the hospital windows ranged between 110 and 114 degrees, and the hospital had no air conditioning. Nevertheless, he was content. When the director of the hospital insisted on putting an air conditioner in his room, he refused. He wanted no special treatment. It was only after Tom Evans pointed out that Bess, who had been sitting with him day after day, was suffering from heat if he wasn't, that Truman sent for the director and had the air conditioning installed immediately. "When the papers tell us that you had a gangrenous gallbladder," wrote Atchison, "I was at once prepared to tell Doc Graham how you got it. It comes from reading the newspapers. No one can escape some malady from this cause. With me it has taken the form of an attack of gout." For Truman's convalescence, Acheson sent a copy of The Reason Why, Cecil Woodham Smith's account of the disastrous charge of the Light Brigade. When you get acquainted with Lords Ragland, Cardigan, and Lucan, you will be reminded of a certain general we know, Acheson said, meaning MacArthur. To Bess, Acheson wrote, "It is touching the way so many people, elevator boys, our cook, taxi drivers, people on the street, keep asking me about the President. He is deeply loved, even by the press." More than 100,000 cards and letters poured into Truman, wishing him a speedy recovery and enough flowers, as he said, to supply every customer in the hospital. From his hospital room on July 6th, he pledged to do everything possible to get his library started and finished as soon as possible. Once released from the hospital, he was immediately back at work. Ed Thompson flew in from New York in November to find that the raw material of the memoirs had grown beyond limits, yet the manuscript was still far from ready. Tactfully, he proposed to the former president that one of life's best staff writers, Ernest Haveman, be sent in to do some reshaping and polishing, but Truman declined. "More important to me," he wrote to Thompson, "especially at this stage, than style or organization of the material are the facts, so that the record of the years of my presidency may be correct. Until this part of the job is completed, I would like you to hold up sending Mr. Haveman or anyone else." Haveman's turn came 3 or 4 weeks later, and for the first time Truman had an experienced writer working with him. Francis Heller would recall how much he himself learned from Haveman, though Haveman did no actual writing, and how hard everyone worked 6, sometimes 7 days a week, going great guns, as Truman said. "The damn thing is turning out much better than I thought it would," he reported to Acheson. But apparently Haveman found the former president a difficult collaborator, and the staff even more troublesome to work with. After a month, he asked to be relieved. Another writer, Hawthorne Daniel, was recruited, now at the request of Doubleday, the publisher that would be bringing out the book once Life had launched its installments. Eventually, too, Doubleday's editor-in-chief Ken McCormick would take part in the cutting and refining, and both Dean Acheson and Sam Rosenman would be asked by Truman to go over the whole accumulation. Acheson's comments were to be of particular value. "The material is more interesting and gripping when you are talking about your own life and your own ideas than it is when you are giving lists of callers at the White House and the activities of the Truman Committee, which do not reveal much about you as a man," Acheson advised in one extended critique. Page 114, line 3. You use the cliché, striped pants boys in the State Department. I should like to see you change this to people in the State Department, not merely because the phrase is tiresome, but because it gives quite a wrong impression of the tremendous support which you gave to the career service and for which they will be forever grateful. In places, as he told Truman, Acheson found the manuscript brusque, didactic, and superficial, quite contrary to what you are. Acheson's lengthy, single-space type comments, running to many pages, would be gone over closely by the staff, who in turn would give Truman their own lengthy comments on Acheson's comments. Ken McCormick sensed that Bess Truman was also playing more of a role than met the eye, since Truman seemed to make better decisions about the manuscript, seemed to improve in his judgments after having talked with her at home in the evenings. "She was his true north, I think," McCormick said years later, remembering how the work had gone. The financial burden of all this for Truman was mounting, for as yet he had received no money. The first payment of his $600,000 from Life was not due until June 30th, when he was supposed to deliver the finished manuscript. By early 1955, the manuscript had grown to approximately 2 million words, whereas the contract had called for only 300,000. After some negotiations, Life agreed to accept 580,000 words, but still the project was behind schedule. Hillman and Noyes now spent more time in Kansas City cutting and trimming. Doubleday, faced with the size of the manuscript, decided to bring the memoirs out in 2 volumes, and so through the first 6 months of 1955, all concentration was on finishing up Volume 1, dealing with only the first 16 months of the presidency, plus the 1 chapter on his early life and 2 others covering the political career prior to Roosevelt's death. Things were moving fast, and things were changing. Acheson and his wife Alice arrived, Acheson to help with the manuscript, and were overnight guests at 219 North Delaware, an event that had the whole town talking, both because there had never before been a former Secretary of State in residence in Independence, and because there had never before been house guests at 219 North Delaware, as far as anyone could recall. On May 8th, Truman's 71st birthday, with some 2,000 people gathering in Slover Park, he turned the first spade of earth at an old-fashioned home-style groundbreaking ceremony for his library, complete with band music. Then, as they had also never done before, he and Bess hosted a buffet dinner at home for some 150 people. It was a sight, wrote Margaret, that she never thought she would see. There was her mother standing at the door of her sanctuary, welcoming each guest. Flying to San Francisco on June 24th to attend the 10th anniversary of the founding of the United Nations, Truman looked out over Wyoming and the Rockies from the vantage point of 14,000 feet. And as he wrote in his room that night in the Fairmont Hotel, he couldn't help but think of Solomon Young. We'd left home at 7 a.m., and at 11 a.m. we're all past the high mountains. Grandpa would have left home at what is now Grandview at 4 a.m., and in all probability would have been 10 or 12 miles west of the Missouri line. What an age we live and have our being in. We had a mountain lake trout lunch, and before we realized it, we're descending into the Great Salt Lake Valley. With the deadline pressure on in the offices at the Federal Reserve Bank building, the work hours grew longer. In the final days of June, some of the staff were working round the clock. Truman handed over a 500,000-word transcript to Ed Thompson in Kansas City on July 4th, 1955, and told him, "I never really appreciated before what is involved in trying to write a book." His first check was for $110,000, and with it came 5 promissory notes for the rest of the $600,000, the last installment not to be paid until January 1960. The opening installment of the memoirs, titled The Most Momentous First 18 Days, appeared in the September 25th issue of Life with a cover photograph of the former President and First Lady standing in front of their Independence home. Doubleday's publication of Volume 1, called Year of Decisions, followed 5 weeks later, with an author's autographing party in the Grand Ballroom of the Mulebach on Tuesday, November 2nd, 1955. To the delight of the publisher, Truman had agreed to sign books for all who came. "I expect to use probably a couple of $1.75 fountain pens that I bought at the 25-cent store, along with a half-dozen others that I happen to have, and I don't want to be in any advertising stunt for the pens whatever." Truman had written to Samuel Vaughn, Doubleday's advertising manager. "I will go along with any party arrangements which you make for Doubleday, but don't get me into any advertising for pens, cakes, or anything, because I won't do it." Arriving in Kansas City a few days in advance to make arrangements, Vaughn was distressed to hear people asking why they would want to come to such an occasion for Truman, when we see him all the time anyway. Greatly concerned, Vaughn worked to line up Battery D veterans, the Boy Scouts, anyone he could think of to be sure there was a crowd. But he need not have bothered. More than 300 people were already in line waiting before the party began. "Hand firm to the end," was the headline in the next morning's paper. It was almost unbelievable. "I had no idea it would be anything like this," Truman said as he saw the crowds grow, the people still coming hour after hour. His hand fairly flew as he signed books until he was doing 6 to 8 autographs a minute. If ever there was a demonstration of his extraordinary vitality, this was it. He kept going hour after hour, not only signing his name but greeting people. "There, that one's all slicked up," he would say with satisfaction, finishing his signature and handing over the book. By the end of the first session he had signed over 1,000 copies. In all, incredibly, he turned out 4,000 autographs in just 5.5 hours. Reporters on hand, his publishers, watched in amazement. Earlier, when Ken McCormick of Doubleday had suggested to Truman that perhaps he might prefer to have the autographs done by a machine, Truman had replied, "I will autograph as many as I can. I am not an expert with the machine, and I would rather do it by hand." Reviewers rightly treated the book as a major event. The first volume of Harry Truman's memoirs, Doubleday, provides a more detailed report on life at the summit of American politics than a president has given since the early days of the Republic, wrote Richard Revere in the New Yorker. Truman was commended for his contribution to history, his understanding of presidential power, his clarity, attention to detail, his appealing mixture of modesty and confidence, as the historian Alan Nevins wrote on the front page of the New York Times Book Review. There was too little autobiography, it was thought, too much that read like an official paper worked over by many hands. In the preface, Truman freely acknowledged the help he had been given. Richard Revere, having covered Truman for years, missed the characteristic pungent manner of expression, Truman in his own words, and wished there were more of what was to be found in Truman's letters to his mother, 18 of which were included in the book, providing, as Revere said, not only relief from the state paper style, but wonderful insights into Truman's style as a human being. As the reviewers implied, too many people had been involved in the task. Truman had been homogenized. He had been made at times even tedious. Atchison's warnings should have been taken more to heart. Truman himself, the vitality, the vividness of his letters, his own way of expressing himself, was missing through great portions of the book. But to a large degree, of course, Truman himself had been responsible for this, by agreeing to the process by which the work was produced. Also, from the start, he seems to have seen the task more as one of recording history than telling his own story. Francis Heller, for example, would never recall Truman speaking of the work in progress as memoirs, only as my history. The inevitable comparisons with Churchill's history of the war were made, though not so unfavorably as might have been supposed. As a literary performance, said Alan Nevins, Truman's book did not rank among the best memoirs of the era. Nevertheless, Nevins emphasized, this was a volume of distinction. His praise exceeded his criticism, and the review, like others, became as much a judgment of the author as of the book. If not one of the landmark memoirs of the century, it was nonetheless an admirable work by one of the most important figures of the century. Altogether, it well expressed one of the most conscientious, dynamic, and, within his horizons, clear-sighted presidents we have ever had, wrote Nevins. His penetrating shrewdness has been underrated. We are equally impressed by his exceptionally high conception of the presidency and his determination to live up to it. In ordinary affairs he seemed commonplace, and in small matters he could make curious blunders. But he grew in his office as few presidents have ever done, and he was sustained by an unusual knowledge of American history and a firm grasp of our best traditions. To the major crisis he brought statesmanlike insight, energy, and courage. There was greatness in the man. The large effect of the book and the series in Life, and Volume 2, which appeared the next spring, was to create renewed interest in Truman and a reconsideration of his presidency. And while his account of events also stirred controversy, protests and rebuttals by such major protagonists as Jimmy Burns and Henry Wallace, publication of the memoirs marked the beginning of what was to be a steady revival of Truman's reputation, and the beginning of an exceptionally happy time for him. Indeed, it may be said that publication of the memoirs marked the opening of one of the happiest passages in his long life. 3. Truman had always wanted a son. It was why he had called Margaret skinny as she grew up, he recently explained in a letter to Atchison. But I wouldn't trade her for a house full of boys, although I always wanted a couple and another girl. In mid-March 1956, at a press conference at the Carlisle Hotel in New York, Margaret announced she was engaged to be married to Elbert Clifton Daniel, Jr., who was an assistant foreign news editor of the New York Times, and at 42, 10 years older than his fiancée. The news was a surprise. Though her parents had known for several weeks, Margaret had succeeded in keeping her romance private. Margaret and Clifton, as he was called, had known each other for more than a year. He was of slightly less than medium height, slim, handsome, well-dressed, and spoke with a trace of a British accent, acquired, it was said, from 10 years as a foreign correspondent in England. He appeared very polished and sophisticated, but as the country soon learned, he, like Margaret, had grown up in a small town, Zebulon, North Carolina, where his father, Elbert Clifton Daniel, Sr., had a drugstore. Alone at his office desk, Truman took up one of his $1.75 pens and wrote a 2-page letter to Atchison. Their friendship, the great trust and mutual admiration, the enjoyment they found in exchanging news on life's turns and human folly, everything that had made the seemingly incongruous bond between them so important during the presidency, had come to mean still more to Truman now. The truth was that the #1 citizen of Independence, Missouri, the president who had come home to be plain Mr. Truman again, sorely missed the company and stimulation of just such people as the worldly Atchison. The letters to and fro between them would steadily increase, Truman speaking his mind, writing from the heart, as he had only until now to the women who were dear to him. He even told Atchison, as once he had told Bess Wallace, that he wrote sometimes just to get a letter in return. "When I hear from you, I always feel better," he would write. "Wish I could sit and talk with you for an hour or 30 minutes or even for 5 minutes. My morale would go up 100%. Unexpectedly and most happily at this late date, Truman found his life enlarged by this close if distant friend, a brother in spirit, a confidant, indeed a male friend such as he had never had before, and this as much as anything was to account for his great increased enjoyment of these years. Now he addressed himself to the latest turn in his personal life. "Margie has put one over on me and got herself engaged to a newsman," he began, the words advancing steadily across the page, the bold certainty of every stroke looking no different from the handwriting in letters written to Bess Wallace from Grandview nearly 50 years before. He strikes me as a very nice fellow, and if Margaret wants him, I'll be satisfied. He seems to be very highly thought of in newspaper circles, and particularly by the New York Times people. The young lady told us about it just a week or two before the announcement and swore us to secrecy. In fact, she made me hang up while she told her mother. Did your daughter do you that way? I was forbidden to tell my brother and sister. Like a couple of amateurs, they went to North Carolina to see his mother and father, nice people, by the way, and then had dinner with Jonathan Daniels, of all people, hoping to keep a secret. The next day they called Daddy and wanted to know what to do. Well, Dad announced the engagement the next morning without a chance to tell his friends. Again, did your daughter do that? Well, we've had at least 2,000 letters and telegrams, and she's had twice as many. Serves her right. As every old man who had a daughter feels, I'm worried and hope things will work out all right. Can't you give me some consolation? Atchison replied at once. Consolation is just what I can give. In the first place, about Margaret's choice. She has always had good judgment and has shown it again here. Alice and I had dinner with them here on her birthday, just a year before we celebrated it in Independence with you. I was completely captivated by Clifton Daniel. He has charm and sense and lots of ability. On the way home I told Alice that there was romance in the wind and that I was all for it. She somewhat acidly remarked that I had so monopolized Mr. Daniel that she hadn't been able to get any idea of Margaret's view of him, that I was getting to be an old matchmaker. This only made my triumph all the sweeter when the announcement came. I stick by my guns and am sure that the man Margaret has chosen is first class and just the one for her. Marriage is the greatest of all gambles, but character helps, and my bets are all on the success of this venture. Now, as to the behavior of daughters and the position of the father of the bride, daughters, I have found, take this business of marriage into their own hands and do as they please. So do sons, or perhaps someone else's daughter decides for them. I explained most lucidly to Mary and David that they should wait until the end of the war to get married, so they got married at once. All in all, the father of the bride is a pitiable creature. No one bothers with him at all. He is always in the way, a sort of backward child, humored but not participating in the big decisions. His only comforter is a bottle of good bourbon. Have you plenty on hand? The wedding took place in Independence on Saturday, April 21st, 1956, in Little Trinity Episcopal Church on Liberty Street, where Bess Wallace and Harry Truman had been married in 1919. It was also followed by a small reception at the home of the bride that was not greatly different from the reception there in 1919, except the party this time was held indoors, out of view of the hundreds of reporters and photographers at the iron fence and the carloads of sightseers passing the house bumper to bumper. The temperature was in the 80s, the shaded lawn clipped and green, the spirea bushes by the porch in bloom. Margaret wore an ankle-length, full-skirted, pale beige wedding dress, fashioned of 200-year-old Venetian lace. At the church, when arriving by limousine with Margaret, and later during the ceremony, the father of the bride appeared a pitiable creature indeed, unhappy and unsmiling. Later at the reception he brightened noticeably, possibly by Atchison's remedy. Less than a month after, he and Bess departed on what was described as a honeymoon of their own, the finest trip of their lives, across Europe in grand style. They were gone 7 weeks, touring Europe by train, France, Italy, Austria, West Germany, France again, Brussels, the Netherlands, England. It rained a good part of the time. Rain, 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 day after day, with sometimes a peep of sun, he wrote in his diary. Yet nothing seemed to lessen his spirits. Bringing the suitcases down from the attic the morning they left home, Truman had slipped on the stairs and twisted his ankle so that it swelled to the size of 2, as he said. But he took a shiny black cane and carried on, covering whatever ground had to be covered the first few days, only a little slower than usual. They departed from the Independence Depot at 7:15 the morning of May 8th, his 72nd birthday. A crowd of friends and family came to see them off. A birthday cake was cut and passed out, a grand party, and there were to be crowds everywhere from then on. The reason given for the trip was a long-standing invitation to Truman to accept an honorary degree at Oxford, and the ceremony at Oxford on June 20th would prove the highlight. "I was so afraid I'd let you down at Oxford, but apparently I didn't," he told Atchison, who, like George Marshall, had already been honored there. Former President Ulysses S. Grant, as part of a famous trip around the world, had spent months touring Europe, where he was received as royalty, and in 1910, at the end of his African safari, former President Theodore Roosevelt delivered a series of lectures across Europe and at Oxford, where he received an honorary degree. For Truman, it was a third trip to Europe, but his first as a private citizen. He was carrying his first passport. He and Bess had long dreamed of a chance to travel abroad. For both it was the trip of a lifetime, and for Bess a first venture ever overseas. They would be 2 of the 500,000 American tourists in Europe that year. Sailing from New York on the United States, accompanied by Stanley Woodward, who had been Truman's chief of protocol, and his wife Sarah, they landed at Le Havre. From there they went directly by train to Paris. By midday, May 17th, his first full day in Paris, Truman was sitting happily at a small outdoor table, sipping coffee at the venerable Café de la Paix, close to the Opéra, where only after a while did heads begin to turn and passers-by stop to stare. He had been there before, he explained, during World War I. At home, the papers carried a wire service photograph of the former president strolling the Place de l'Opéra, swinging his cane like a boulevardier. Reporters dogged his steps wherever he went. Several hundred had been waiting at the Gare Saint-Lazare when he arrived in the city, and there were scarcely ever less than a dozen at his side afterward. Mr. Truman is as popular in Europe as he is in Missouri, readers at the Independence Examiner learned in a United Press story from Paris. He was cheered and welcomed by people in the street. In Rome, the welcome at the railroad station was tumultuous, with a crowd of hundreds shouting, "Viva Truman!" And even in English, "Hi, Harry!" He and his party stayed at the Hassler Hotel at the head of the Spanish Steps. For a conducted tour of Rome's ancient monuments, Truman had as a guide, of all people, Henry Luce, who was filling in for his wife, Claire Booth Luce, the American ambassador to Italy, who had taken ill. The sight of Harry Truman and Henry Luce, side by side, speculating on the vanished empire of the Romans as they sat in the Colosseum, was one not to be forgotten. Scores of American tourists cheered Truman and followed along. On Rome's Capitol Hill, in front of the giant equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius, he started introducing himself and shaking hands. "How are you? I'm Harry Truman." "I'm Paul Schultheis of Rochester, New York," responded the amazed tourist. He and Bess had a rare Sunday audience with Pope Pius XII that marked the first time an American president had been received at the Holy See since Woodrow Wilson's formal visit on Pope Benedict XV in 1919. Bess wore black and a lace veil over her head, Truman a black cutaway coat, striped trousers, and a top hat. "A most happy visit indeed," he said. Then, in 2 weeks' travels through Italy, they saw Mount Vesuvius, the ruins of Pompeii, the ancient Roman temple of Paestum near Salerno. They explored the green hills of Umbria, where St. Francis once lived with the birds and animals. They shopped for leather goods on the centuries-old Ponte Vecchio, over the Arno in Florence, gazed at the Botticellis in the Uffizi Gallery. In Venice, he and Bess, like every other tourist, strolled St. Mark's Square and rode together in the gondola down the Grand Canal. Between times, Truman told reporters that the weather in Italy reminded him of Texas. He declared that victory for the Democrats in the presidential election in the fall was not probable but inevitable, and got himself in a good deal of hot water by saying that the bloody World War II battles of Salerno and Anzio had been unnecessary and the fault of some squirrel-headed general. He was having a glorious time, enjoying immensely the setting of so much of the history he had loved since boyhood, and enjoying immensely the attention he received. At Naples, the crowds had tossed flowers in his path. "This is fantastic," he said, openly astonished. If the picture of Truman with Henry Luce amid the ruins of ancient Rome had seemed the unlikeliest of holiday vignettes, Truman succeeded in topping it at Florence, when he, Bess, and the Woodwards were the luncheon guests of Bernard Berenson at Berenson's famous villa, I Tatti, overlooking the city. It was a luminous setting of incomparable paintings, sculpture, a library of 55,000 volumes, and the place where the legendary Berenson, B.B., widely regarded as the consummate connoisseur, the world's last great aesthete, held court. A Lithuanian Jew by birth, a graduate of Harvard, and a leading authority on Italian Renaissance art, he had made I Tatti his home, shrine, institution, since before World War I, when Truman was still on the farm. A tiny, frail, but godlike figure with a white beard, now nearly 91, Berenson was still immensely vital and talkative. His flow of guests, of celebrated literary and theatrical figures, was unending. J.B. Priestley, Robert Lowell, Alberto Moravia, Laurence Olivier, Mary McCarthy. They came to listen, since customarily B.B. did most of the talking, and of course to be able to say they knew the great man. "We just had to look him up. He was the best in his line," Truman would later tell Merle Miller. In his diary at the time, Truman said he found Berenson as clear-headed and mentally alert as a man of 35 or 40. He is considered the greatest authority on Renaissance art and is noted for his epigrams, one of which struck me forcibly. We were discussing world affairs, and he remarked that modern diplomacy had degenerated into open insults openly arrived at. We discussed the causes of the First World War, the Austrian Prime Minister at that time, the Serbian situation, and the whys and wherefores of the Austrian ultimatum which started the war. Truman was greatly stimulated by Berenson's company and delight in conversation, much as he had been years ago at the Sunday afternoon teas with Louis Brandeis. In a letter to Berenson later, recalling the pleasant visit, Truman wrote in a postscript, "I wish the powers that be would listen, think, and mock at things as you have." But more remarkable was Berenson's reaction to the former American president, which Berenson recorded in his own diary at the time. "Harry Truman and his wife lunched yesterday, came at 1 and stayed till 3. Both as natural, as unspoiled by high office, as if he had got no further than alderman of Independence, Missouri. In my long life I have never met an individual with whom I felt so instantly at home. He talked as if he had always known me, openly, easily, with no reserve, so far as I could judge, ready to touch on any subject, no matter how personal. I always felt what a solid and sensible basis there is in the British stock of the USA if it can produce a man like Truman. Now I feel more assured about America than in a long time. If the Truman miracle can still occur, we need not fear even the Senator Joe McCarthy's. Truman captivated even Willie Mostyn Owen, age 27, ultra-critical, and like all Englishmen of today, hard of hearing anything good about Americans, and disposed to be condescending to them at best. At Salzburg, in Truman's honor, the organist of Salzburg Cathedral played Mozart's Ninth Sonata on the 250-year-old organ, and at Mozart's birthplace, Truman himself played a Mozart sonata on Mozart's own clavichord. I found that it was somewhat different from the modern piano, but it makes beautiful music. This Mozart town has certainly been a joy to me. From Salzburg, the expedition moved on to Bonn, capital of the West German Republic that Truman had helped create, and during the brief rain-soaked stay he met with Konrad Adenauer for the first time. Swinging back through France again, the tourists kept to a steady schedule, stopping at Versailles, which Truman did not much enjoy. He kept thinking of how the money to build it had been squeezed from the people. Chartres Cathedral, which he loved despite the pouring rain. Then Chenonceau, the lovely 16th-century chateau in the Loire Valley, which he had wanted particularly to see because of its connection to Catherine de' Medici, one of his favorite historic figures. Of course, there are all sorts of traditions and stories about the happenings of the days of Catherine, he observed in his diary. But she was a remarkable woman and a Medici, all of whom believed in government by deviation as set out in The Prince by Machiavelli. Catherine was the mother of 10 children, 3 of whom became kings of France, and 2 of whom became queens. Quite a record for a tough, conspiratorial old woman. Truman was tireless, determined to see everything, and fascinated by nearly all he saw. Best tried valiantly to keep the pace, seldom smiling, at least in view of the photographers. The itinerary would have exhausted people half their age. Their route in France, interestingly, included no return visits to the Vosges Mountains, the Argonne, or Verdun, Truman apparently having no wish to see any of those places ever again. There were big crowds to cheer him at the train stations in Brussels, The Hague, and Amsterdam, where at the Dutch State Museum he and Bess saw the largest exhibit of Rembrandt's ever held, and had lunch with Queen Juliana at the Royal Sustic Palace. Then on June 17th, they were on their way to England, the part of the trip Truman had looked forward to most of all. "We crossed the Channel on the night boat," he recorded, "and landed at the English side in beautiful sunshine." It may be fairly said that in his long, eventful life and an extraordinary career with many surprising turns and times of great fulfillment, there were few occasions that meant so much to Truman as the ceremony that took place at Oxford on Wednesday, June 20th, 1956. Wearing the traditional crimson robe and crushed black velour hat of Oxford, the man who had never been to college nor ever made a pretense of erudition walked at the head of the procession beside the public orator at one of the world's oldest, most distinguished universities. "Never, never in my life," he had whispered to a reporter, "did I ever think I'd be a Yank at Oxford." The ceremony, called the Encomium and conducted in Latin, was held in Oxford's 300-year-old Sheldonian Theatre, designed by Christopher Wren. The audience numbered more than 1,000 people. As Truman stood in the center facing the crimson-robed professors of Oxford, he heard the public orator present Harry cum Truman for an honorary degree of Doctorus in Jure Civili, Doctor of Civil Law. Then the towering, ornately robed Earl of Halifax, Chancellor of the University and former British Ambassador to Washington, admitted Harry cum Truman into the ancient fellowship of Oxford, lauding him in Latin as truest of allies, direct in your speech and in your writings, and ever a pattern of simple courage. The applause that followed went on for a full 3 minutes. Truman, moved to tears, searched beneath his academic gown for a handkerchief. An elderly professor told a reporter that he had attended many such convocations, but had never heard such applause. "Mr. Truman is very popular in this country," he said. Recovering himself, Truman smiled broadly. That night he was honored at a white-tied dinner for 400 returning graduates of Christ Church College. "Every person born in the 20th century is entitled to the benefits of the 20th century," he said in his speech. "We must declare in a new Magna Carta, in a new Declaration of Independence, that henceforth economic well-being and security, that health and education and decent living standards are among our inalienable rights." Every man and woman was entitled to the full benefits of the best in medicine, he added, striking an old theme. Every child was entitled to a first-rate education. There should be no economic worries for the elderly in their declining years. "Give 'em hell, Harry Cum," the students of Oxford called from their windows as he departed. A still more dazzling white-tied dinner followed the next night in London at the Savoy, the annual stag dinner of the Pilgrims, the leading Anglo-American society dedicated to maintaining close ties between the two nations. And again Truman was a triumph, Lord Halifax paying him what to most present was the ultimate compliment. "I think we in this room feel that you are the sort of chap with whom all of us would be quite happy to go tiger hunting." He had been getting along very well in England, Truman said at the start of his remarks. So far he had not needed an interpreter. "A good many of the difficulties between our two countries," he continued, "spring not from our differences, but from the fact that we are so much alike. Another problem we have is that in election years we behave somewhat as primitive peoples do at the time of the full moon." But the essence of his warning was that a great, serene, and peaceful future can slip from us quite as irrevocably by neglect, division, and inaction as by spectacular disaster. He hoped that both nations would never become careless about our strength and our unity. "And not least of all, let us escape from this modern idea of the mass psychologists that we should be guided not by what we honestly believe is wise and right, but by some supposed reflecting of what other people think of us. I am ready to give up the complexity of propaganda with its mass psychology in favor of Mark Twain's simpler admonition. Always do right. It will please some people and astonish the rest." He was most happy to see London, Truman wrote in his diary. "Never been here. It is a wonderful city." Visiting the House of Commons on Home Affairs Day, he listened to the opposition ask questions about everything from roads to bawdy houses and gangsters. At the House of Lords, he sat through a long-winded speech as boresome as any in the United States Senate. "England is prosperous, cordial, and courteous," he recorded. "From lords to taxi drivers and policemen, they recognize and wave and bow to the former president. When they have a chance, they show by word and deed that they still like us and appreciate our friendship. It is heartwarming." On June 24th, at Chartwell, the Churchill family estate, 40 miles south of London, Sir Winston and Lady Churchill, daughters Sarah and Mary's husband, Christopher Soames, and Lord Beaverbrook were in the driveway waiting as the Trumans arrived for lunch in a chauffeur-driven Armstrong Siddeley. "This is just like old times," Truman said, as he and Churchill greeted each other. Inside, a butler brought a tray of drinks, and before a bronze bust of Franklin Roosevelt, the two men made what appeared to be a silent toast. Lunch finished, each swinging a walking stick, they strolled in the gardens. "It was all over too soon," Truman wrote in his diary. The house faces a hill covered with rhododendrons, which were in full bloom. Behind the house is a beautiful garden, and below that a valley containing a lake in the distance, a lovely view which Sir Winston called the Weald of Kent. He showed me a large number of his paintings in the house and told me he had some 400 more in his studio in the valley below the house. We didn't have time to visit the studio. It was a very pleasant visit and a happy one for me. Churchill, Truman thought, seemed as alert mentally as ever. But his physical condition shows his 82 years. He walks more slowly and he doesn't hear well. He told me that he could do whatever had to be done as he always did, but that he'd rather not do it. He walked around and up and down steps with no more effort than would be expected of a man his age. He remarked that it would be a great thing for the world if I should become President of the United States again. I told him there was no chance of that. They said goodbye, not knowing if they would ever see one another again, and they did not. On June 26th, as reported in the Independence Examiner, Mr. and Mrs. Truman joined the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh at Buckingham Palace for lunch. On June 28th, from Southampton, their grand tour over, the Trumans sailed for home. During the visit at Chartwell, Lord Beaverbrook had told Truman that on his European trip he had made the greatest ambassador of goodwill America ever had. Now the same refrain was heard repeatedly. "Too bad he's not campaigning for anything in this country," an American reporter overheard an English spectator remark as Truman boarded the boat train in London. "He'd win any election." The London Evening Standard headlined the visit as the Truman Triumph. The Daily Telegraph described him as the living and kicking symbol of everything that everyone likes best about the United States. In the tradition of homespun Benjamin Franklin, he had charmed Europe by being himself. "Never," said the United Press, "has an ordinary American been given such a red carpet treatment from the brass and such a warm welcome from the people as was accorded that jaunty traveler from Missouri." On reaching home, Truman never let up the pace. He was scarcely unpacked before plunging into election-year politics in a determined and unsuccessful effort to see Averell Harriman rather than Adlai Stevenson win the Democratic nomination. Arriving in Chicago for the convention in August, Truman backed Harriman, who had been elected governor of New York 2 years earlier, because, as Truman said, he thought the country needed a president who wanted the job. "Stevenson lacks the kind of fighting spirit we need to win," Truman charged at a jammed press conference at the Blackstone. A few weeks earlier, while stopping at the Blackstone for a Truman Library dinner, Truman had talked privately with Stevenson, who asked what he was doing wrong. Truman had gone to the window and, pointing to a man in the street below, said, "The thing you have to do is learn how to reach that man." For a time it appeared Truman might turn things on end. "Harry S. Truman had the Democratic Party chewing its fingernails down to the cuticle today, and he loved every second of it," wrote Russell Baker in the New York Times. While the party's other demigods fretted and stewed and guessed, Mr. Truman was as exhilarated as a small boy given free run of the circus. At the height of the suspense, he blithely took off from the politicians and went down to the south side of town to lead a parade. There, for Chicago's vast Negro population, it was Bud Billiken Day. Bud Billiken is a mythical, heroic godfather for the town's Negro children. In the parade, Mr. Truman drove 2.5 miles to the enthusiastic cheers of 100,000 spectators. But in fact, his efforts came to nothing. The nomination went easily to Stevenson, and to many it seemed Truman had succeeded only in making himself a contradictory, even pitiful figure who confused his popularity with real power. Truman, however, showed no signs of bitterness or regret, and immediately endorsed the nominee. Stevenson's chances in November were perfectly wonderful, and pledged the full support of the old man from Missouri. Besides, as he liked to say, he had had himself a time. "When I arrived in Chicago," he wrote to Atchison, "things were dead, no life, no nothing. I decided to wake them up. I'm going to do all I can to help win this election. How I wish I were 10 years younger." He campaigned actively for the ticket, traveling to Milwaukee, Texas, Boston, New York, San Francisco, Gary, Indiana, and Pittsburgh, where he and Eisenhower were staying at the same hotel but never met. A month after Stevenson's defeat and Eisenhower's re-election, Truman was writing to Lyndon Johnson, the Democratic Majority Leader in the Senate, "I've never wanted to pose as a prophet, nor do I intend to be one now, but I do want to keep the Democratic Party a party of the people. We can never win unless it is." 1957 was a landmark year for Truman. On June 5th in New York, Margaret had a baby son, and both Trumans were on the train heading east the very next day. On June 7th, the New York Times carried a photograph of the proud grandparents at the hospital looking through the window at the baby, Clifton Truman Daniel. When, in another few days, Margaret and the baby came home to the Daniels' New York apartment and her father asked if he might hold the baby, she insisted he first take off his jacket and be seated. Dad sat there for a long time, rocking him back and forth. Less than a month later, Truman was moving out of the Federal Reserve Bank building and into an all-new suite of offices at the new Truman Library. Formal dedication of the building took place on July 6th. The two things he had said he wanted most after leaving the White House, to become a grandfather and to see his library established, had both come to pass. Former President Hoover, Eleanor Roosevelt, Speaker Sam Rayburn, 4 United States senators, 9 governors, including Averell Harriman, Dean Acheson, John Snyder, some dozen or more from Truman's White House staff, his family, neighbors, a crowd in all of 5,000 people were present for the dedication, a fortunate few seated in the shade of the trees, the majority taking the full force of the Missouri summer sun. In the history of independence there had been no occasion like it. "I expect to be knee-deep in big shots July 6th, and I want you and Alice to be here to help me out of what Huey Long would call a deep, more ass." Truman had written excitedly to Acheson, "Be sure and come." The main speaker, addressing the crowd from the steps of the building, was the former governor of California and Republican candidate for Vice President Earl Warren, now the Chief Justice of the United States, who acclaimed the library as a milestone in American history, and Harry S. Truman as a man of action, tireless, fearless, and decisive, adding that he himself had personally learned to appreciate the former president's dynamic fighting qualities in the fall of 1948. Mr. Truman, who has an abiding interest in our national history, has arranged for the preservation of his papers in this library in such manner that his administration will be one of the clearest ages of history. It is in compliance with his public-spirited generosity that I dedicate this building as a museum and a library to safeguard, exhibit, and facilitate the use of its valuable resources, that the American people and all the peoples of this earth may gain by their wide and wise use understanding of ourselves and our times, and wisdom to choose the right paths in years that lie ahead. The building was long and low, crescent-shaped, and built of Indiana limestone in an architectural style that no one was quite able to categorize. Modern seemed to apply, though the main entrance with its square columns also had a decidedly classic Egyptian look. It had been designed by a local architect, Alonzo H. Gentry, assisted by Edward Neild, who came up with a scheme quite unlike what Truman had been expecting, but that he decided not to reject. Though only 1 story tall, the building, with its full basement, had a total of 70,000 square feet of floor space. Finished in 2 years, it had cost thus far $1,800,000. 2 Truman Library dinners in New York and Philadelphia in 1954 had raised $45,000 each. More than 30 different labor unions had contributed generously, $25,000 from Sidney Hillman's Amalgamated Clothing Workers, $10,000 from the American Federation of Musicians, $10,000 from John L. Lewis, $250,000 from the United Steelworkers. Dean Acheson, Averill Harriman, Ed Pauley, and William Clayton made substantial private donations. But in all, the money had come from some 17,000 contributions, large and small, from every part of the country, and Truman acknowledged every gift, regardless of the amount. The 3.5 million documents already in the library were only the beginning of the collection that was to be amassed as time went on, when other figures from the Truman administration, such as Acheson, contributed their own papers. For Truman personally, from this point on, the library was to be the focus of his life. If the immense effort devoted to the memoirs had proven something of a disappointment, his library was to be an unqualified success. He was also successful in convincing Congress, working through Democratic Representative John McCormack of Massachusetts, that all existing presidential papers should be indexed and put on microfilm. As he said, this was something that should have been done generations earlier. Yet until he raised the issue, no one had bothered to make the effort, a point for which he deserved far more credit than he received. With the library established and in operation in Independence, a large part of the Truman land at Grandview was sold to a Kansas City developer, B.F. Weinberg and Associates. The old farmhouse, its barn, and immediate acres were kept in the family, but some 224 acres of the prime land where Solomon Young had long ago staked his claim, and where Truman had labored so many seasons, were now to give way to the advance of suburbia and become a shopping center. For Truman it meant the end of a heritage that had come to mean more and more to him, partly out of sentiment, but also from a realization of how much his own makeup and attitudes derived from his rural background. He took particular pleasure, obvious pride, in describing himself as a retired farmer. "Hey there, farmer," Sam Rayburn would greet him over the telephone, knowing how it pleased him. "I sure hate to see the old place go," he was quoted in the Kansas City Star. But the sale, as he also said, meant financial security at last, for Truman, as for Vivian and Mary Jane. And while with the transaction went a good deal of sadness, it affirmed the old faith that, come what may, land was wealth to count on. It wasn't Truman's rise to political power or his world renown, his books or lectures, or the legacy of his wife's family that saw him through in the end, but the old farm at Grandview. The sale was announced in January 1958. What the final figure was, what his share came to, are not known. However, a tallying up of all his bank balances a year and a half later, dated August 14, 1959, has survived and shows him with a total of $208,548.07. And this did not include what he had in government and municipal bonds and a few stocks. The final financial returns on his memoirs, after expenses and taxes, were turning out to be very much less than anticipated. Even with his payments from life extended over 5 years, he still had to pay 67% federal and state income taxes, and this he found particularly discouraging since in 1949 General Eisenhower had been permitted by the Internal Revenue authorities to treat his sale of Crusade in Europe for $635,000 as a capital gain on the grounds that he was not a professional author. Eisenhower had paid a tax of only 25%. At the time the Eisenhower question was at issue, the White House had intervened. Now the Eisenhower White House declined to become involved. Truman's expenses for the memoirs, for staff and office space, had amounted to $153,000, according to a letter he wrote to John McCormack. His net profit over the 5-year period would end up, he figured, at about $37,000. Had it not been for the fact that I was able to sell some property that my brother, sister, and I inherited from our mother, I would practically be on relief, but with the sale of that property I am not financially embarrassed. He was not asking for a pension, he told McCormick. He wanted justice. He thought the least a former president merited was a government allowance covering perhaps 70% of the necessary office expenses and overheads to meet his responsibilities. As you know, we passed a bill which gave all 5-star generals and admirals 3 clerks and all the emoluments that went with their office when they retired. It seems rather peculiar that a fellow who spent 18 years in government service and succeeded in getting all these things done for the people he commanded should have to go broke in order to tell the people the truth about what really happened. It seems to me, in all justice, a part of this tremendous overhead should be met by the public. With the help of Charlie Murphy, he took his case to Speaker Rayburn and Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson, with the result that in 1958 Congress passed a law providing former presidents with a $25,000 annual pension, money for staff, office space, and free mailing privileges. For quite some time, since even before Truman left the White House, Dean Acheson had been eager to arrange for him to come to Yale. Truman would be the recipient of what was known at Yale as a Chubb Fellowship, whereby he would be the honored guest of the university for several days to lecture and to meet with students and faculty. The prospect delighted Truman. He thought highly of Yale out of regard for Acheson and such other Yale graduates in his administration as Harriman, Lovett, and Roger Tubby, but also because Yale, as Truman said, was the kind of great university he wished he had been able to attend. What pleased him most was that Acheson wanted him to do it. "I would be proud to appear anywhere with you from Yale to 1908 Main in Kansas City. That's the address of the Pendergast Club," Truman had written in 1952, obviously enjoying the picture of his elegant Secretary of State hobnobbing with the boys at 1908 Main, as he knew Acheson would, too. Acheson, who was a member of the Yale Corporation, had set things in motion, and in a letter to Professor Thomas G. Bergen, who would be Truman's host, Acheson provided what stands as one of the finest, most perceptive descriptions ever written of his friend the President. Mr. Truman is deeply interested in and very good with the young. His point of view is fresh, eager, confident. He has learned the hard way, but he has learned a lot. He believes in his fellow man, and he believes that with will and courage and some intelligence, the future is manageable. This is good for undergraduates. He is easy, informal, pungent. He should not be asked to do lectures for publication. The pressures on him are too great, and it is not his field. It is not what he says, but what he is which is important to young men, and this gets communicated. I should want Mr. Truman to be received at Yale with honor, with simplicity, not as a show, not with controversy, not as a lecturer in a field which I do not believe is yet a discipline, political theory or science, but as one who could, if in some way we were wired for spirit, give our undergraduates more sense of what their lives are worth, how to spend them for value, than anyone I know. As it was, Truman did not go to Yale until the spring of 1958. He stayed 3 days and was an immediate hit with students and faculty. Even the crusty Yale librarian, an arch-Republican who had openly stated his distaste for Truman, refusing at first to receive that man when Truman expressed interest in seeing the Franklin papers, wound up wanting Truman to stay longer so they might talk at greater length, and afterward told others he had had no idea how much the president knew or how far-ranging were his interests. On his early morning walks through campus, Truman was trailed by students and local reporters. There were dinners in his honor and repeated warm applause, and he loved it all. "I've never had a better time anywhere," he wrote Acheson. "Yale still rings in my ears. What a time we had," he said again in another letter. He was in steady demand now, with 200 to 300 speaking invitations a month. At home he seemed to radiate good feeling. "He's so damn happy," said a friend, "that it makes me happy just being around him." Tom Evans had asked him to join a regular group for noontime bourbon, lunch, and poker at the Kansas City Club, an exclusive gathering known as the 822 Club for the suite it occupied. Though Truman had been an honorary member of the Kansas City Club since he was elected to the Senate, he had never felt particularly welcomed by its members, most of whom were Republicans. The Kansas City Club had never been exactly his crowd. He had been looked down upon as both a Democrat and a politician, not the sort one would want to know personally. But in no time he had become the most popular member of the group, the pride of the 822 Club, an elevating influence, as was said. It was just terrific. He really bowled them over, Evans told life writer John Osborne for an article titled Happy Days for Harry. Osborne was struck by Truman's phenomenal vigor, the pleasure of his company to others. "Why, God damn it, Mr. President, I'm going to raise you," he heard exclaimed over the poker table at the 822 Club. The major achievement of his latter years, wrote Osborne, was a rare one of its kind, and it has a place in the story of our times. At the age of 74, in the bright winter of his life, Harry Truman is a genuinely happy man. At a benefit performance of the Kansas City Philharmonic, Truman in white tie and tails conducted the orchestra in Seuss's Stars and Stripes Forever. Soon he and Bess were off again for another summer sojourn in Europe, a more private, quiet tour this time, through the south of France, accompanied by Sam and Dorothy Rosenman. That fall, in the 1958 congressional campaign, Truman was back on the trail again, delivering some 25 speeches in 20 different states. Lecturing at Columbia University the next year, he referred to himself as an old stiff, but few people in the busiest part of their lives were as active as he. Truman, reported Cabell Phillips, was getting a bigger kick out of life than ever before. In an article for the New York Times Magazine on the former president as he turned 75, Phillips quoted a Kansas City friend saying, "Harry feels that he's square with the world, that he gave it his best and got its best in return. Now he's enjoying the dividends." I found him looking pink and fit, with the same crisp smile and sparkling eyes and the same firm handshake which I remembered from earlier years, wrote Phillips. And increasing numbers of writers, reporters, and well-wishers made the pilgrimage to see him at the Truman Library to try to divine what the magic was. To Dean Acheson, Truman's salient quality was his vitality. Here was a man overflowing with life force, with incurable curiosity, no brooding image in a history book, but vigorous, powerful, full of the zest of life. Margaret had told her father that he talked too much. "She says I'm just like my 2-year-old grandson," Truman cheerfully related to a reporter from out of town. "She says that he runs all the time, never walks, and talks all the time, and never says anything." Showing visitors the layout of my library, he would move briskly down the halls, talking a steady stream, pausing frequently to greet groups of visitors, and especially if they were students. The library proper, the actual collection of presidential papers, would not be open to researchers until May of 1959, but for now there was the museum to see, with displays of photographs, gifts to the president, everything from an ear of Iowa corn to a jewel-encrusted sword from Ibn Saud. There was a small auditorium and a replica of the Oval Office, which, though slightly reduced in scale, was furnished as it had been during his years in the White House. "I want this to be a place where young people can come and learn what the office of the president is, what a great office it is, no matter who happens to be in it at the time." He did not care a damn about all the attention on himself. "They said it was necessary to put me all over the place just to show how one particular president worked." But clearly the focus on his life and achievements pleased him very much indeed. He loved his office, a bright, spacious room with books and sliding glass panels that opened onto a private patio and garden. His desk was the same big mahogany desk he had used in the upstairs study at the White House. He was there nearly every day, Sunday included, except when he was traveling. As was often said, the most interesting item on display at the Truman Library was Truman himself. He was always on the job early. Some mornings at his desk before the staff arrived, he would answer the phone himself, telling callers what the library hours were, or in reply to further questions saying he knew because it was his library. This is the old man himself. About noon, if not going into town to the 822 Club, he would go home for lunch. Bess remarked privately that if she never saw another sardine or peanut butter sandwich, she would be very happy. "You know, this 5-day week doesn't work with me," he told Acheson. "I guess I'm old-fashioned. I work every day and Sunday too, even if Exodus 2, 8, 9, 10, and 11 and Deuteronomy 5, 13, and 14 say I shouldn't. I think probably those admonitions were the first labor laws we know about. But someone had to fix things so the rest can work 5 days, coffee breaks and all." Having the library gave purpose to his days. The most satisfactory part of the whole effort of creating the library, said David Lloyd, a former White House aide who had taken the leading part in the fundraising and organization of the project, was that it provided Truman with a base where he can sit happily among his beloved books, conducting his tremendous correspondence, saying what he thinks and doing as he pleases, able to carry on his old-fashioned American occupation of being himself. He was there in total 6.5 days a week for 9 years, longer than his 2 terms in the White House. And as at the White House, the staff adored him. "Mr. Truman was one of the most thoughtful persons we have known," remembered Dr. Philip C. Brooks, the first director. "He had an optimistic outlook, and a conversation with him never failed to give one's spirits a lift. Many times people have written about Mr. Truman as having a temper and shooting from the hip in his remarks. We never saw the temper, though we saw plenty of candor. He was rarely wrong." David Lloyd and the archivist of the United States, Wayne Grover, had convinced Truman that there ought to be a mural in the main lobby to enliven the space and strike an appropriate historic theme for visitors as they entered the building. When Lloyd and Grover recommended the Missouri painter Thomas Hart Benton, whose great-uncle and namesake had been one of Missouri's first 2 U.S. senators, as the perfect artist to undertake the work, Truman bluntly said no. He thought Benton had made a mockery of Tom Pendergast in a mural at the Capitol in Jefferson City done in 1936. Further, he did not care for Benton's style. Shown a Benton painting called The Kentuckian, Truman recalled that both of his grandfathers were from Kentucky and neither looked like that long-necked monstrosity. Nevertheless, a meeting was arranged by Lloyd and Grover, who were sure that Truman and Benton would like each other if given the chance to discover how much they had in common. Benton, gruff, opinionated, outspoken to a fault, often profane and extremely vital, had been born, like Truman, in southwestern Missouri, in Little Neosho, in 1889, and had grown up with politics. His father had served several terms in Congress. Truman went with Lloyd and Grover to visit Benton at his studio in Kansas City in the spring of 1957. As predicted, the two men quickly became fast friends. A contract was signed in 1958, and with the mural underway, Truman took obvious pleasure in Benton's company, pride in Benton's friendship, and at one point, at Benton's urging, climbed up the scaffold to help him paint a corner of the sky. The first day Truman offered Benton a drink in his office, pulling a bottle of bourbon from his desk and saying, "I hear you like this." Benton took it as a calculated provocation by Truman, a way to test him. "This performance on the part of a president of the United States embarrassed me," Benton remembered. "There is no good reason why it should have, because it was a common act of human hospitality, but there was still about Harry Truman an aura of power." Later, as the bourbon ritual became more established and Benton would ask for a second drink, Truman would tell him no. "Tom, you're driving a car. You can't have another because you've got some work to do around here, and I'm not going to take any risks with you." I was now, in effect, his man, Benton wrote, and he was going to protect me, and he did. The theme for the mural was arrived at only after considerable discussion. Truman had first thought it should be about Jefferson and the Louisiana Purchase, with the emphasis on Jefferson's foresight. Benton had said there was no way he could paint foresight. "Well, what the hell is it you can paint?" Truman said. Benton suggested that the mural be about independence and its importance in the opening of the West, and so it was agreed. "I thought at first that the president would also want to be included in the mural," Benton later told an interviewer, but he very emphatically turned that down. Benton's fee was $60,000. The work took him 2 years. Completed in 1961, entitled Independence in the Opening of the West, the mural included no specific events of written history nor any identifiable personages. The theme was expressed with symbolic figures, the great human stream that had passed through, with Plains Indians, trappers, hunters, French voyageurs, giving way to a tide of settlers and their black slaves. It was robust, colorful, romantic, and as literal as a magazine illustration, with 2 additional lower panels showing the Missouri River Landing and Independence Square in the 1840s, the time when Truman's grandparents arrived. Truman thought it was wonderful. Showing visitors about the library, he rarely failed to stop in front of the mural to praise it and explain the history portrayed. His friend Tom Benton, he now liked to say, was the best damn painter in America. Attendance at the library was up to more than 150,000 people a year, a figure that delighted him. In May 1960, Margaret had a second child, another boy, William Wallace Daniel. Meantime, Truman was finishing up another book to be called Mr. Citizen, a collection of essays on life and the world at large, written originally for the American Weekly, the Sunday supplement owned by Hearst, Truman's past nemesis. He had liked particularly being paid and publicized by Hearst. There was no praise sweeter, he said, than the praise of old enemies. As Atchison observed, Truman was no brooding image in a history book. He expressly disliked the term elder statesman as applied to him. "When a good politician dies, he becomes a statesman," he would say. "I want to continue as a politician for a long time." It had become a standard line. "I like being a nosebuster and an ass-kicker much better," he told Atchison privately. To mark his 75th birthday on May 8th, the Democratic National Committee staged a nationwide celebration, a star-spangled television broadcast that included appearances by Adlai Stevenson, Eleanor Roosevelt, Jack Benny, Leonard Bernstein, Isaac Stern, H.V. Kaltenborn, and such old personal friends as Monsignor Curtis Tiernan, in a series of spoken and musical tributes, much of the broadcast originating at a $100-a-plate dinner for Truman at the Waldorf Astoria in New York. A few days earlier in Washington, he had said he had no favorite candidate for 1960 as yet, only that he wanted to see the party nominate a man who could win, and he had every intention of taking part. "What do you think? How are you going to keep me home?" In October 1959, George Marshall had died, and for Truman it was another and the heaviest of a succession of personal blows, as slowly but steadily close friends and favorite members of his former official family began to pass from the scene. Fred Vinson had died in 1953, Eddie Jacobson in 1955, Alban Barkley in 1956, Admiral Leahy in July 1959. Hearing that Marshall was dying, Truman had telephoned Marshall's wife in North Carolina to say he was on his way by plane. But she told him not to come because the general would not know him. "She and I spent most of my call weeping," Truman wrote to Atchison. "Do you suppose any president of the United States ever had two such men with him as you and the general?" he would say in another letter. At a brief Episcopal funeral service for Marshall in the chapel at Fort Myer, Virginia, Truman and Eisenhower sat side by side in the same pew at the front, their common grief partly easing the strain between them. A new generation of politicians was bidding to take power. With Eisenhower retiring from office and Richard Nixon the probable choice for a Republican nominee, the chance of a Democratic victory looked promising. Of those Democrats in the running, Truman's favorites were Stuart Symington and Lyndon Johnson, neither of whom had much of a chance. Truman refused to consider Stevenson for a third try. Nor was he enthusiastic about John F. Kennedy, whom he considered too young and inexperienced. He did not want a Catholic. It was not that he was against Catholics, only that he was against losing. Remembering what had happened to Al Smith, he did not think a Catholic could be elected. He also thought Kennedy had been too approving of Joe McCarthy, and he disliked Kennedy's father quite as much as ever. Joe Kennedy had spent over $4 million to buy the nomination for his son, Truman told Margaret. To others he quipped, "It's not the Pope I'm afraid of, it's the Pop." John Kennedy had called on Truman at the Mayflower Hotel in January 1960 during one of Truman's visits to Washington. According to Kennedy's own notes on the meeting, he urged Truman not to announce his support for any candidate until he, Kennedy, had had a chance to come to independence and give him all the facts as I saw them. If at the convention the contest became a deadlock, then, Kennedy suggested, Truman could intervene in the name of party unity. But until then it was important, Kennedy said, to let the primary process run its course. Truman expressed warm regard for both Kennedy and Hubert Humphrey, the other leading contender, and ended the meeting by telling Kennedy he would do nothing to hurt him. Bess Truman was advising her husband to stay out of the whole affair. She refused to get excited about the Democratic Party and told Dad he was crazy if he went to another convention at the age of 76, remembered Margaret. Let the next generation fight it out among themselves, that was her attitude. But like John Struther, the man he had recalled when meeting the son-in-law on his morning walk, the grand old man who wouldn't tell his age, Truman too wanted to be young with the young men. He sometimes felt forgotten. On Capitol Hill in Washington, late one evening, a young Senate aide answered the phone. The operator said she had a long-distance person-to-person call for Senator Symington. When the aide said the senator had gone for the day and asked if he might know who was calling, he heard a familiar, clipped voice come on the line. "Just tell him Harry S. Truman called. Used to be President of the United States." In April, Atchison wrote to tell Truman that if Kennedy were to stub his toe in the West Virginia primary, then probably the nomination would go to Stevenson. "I hate to say this, but I think the only possible alternative is Stu, and I doubt very much, though I am for him, that he can make it. He just doesn't seem to catch hold. Maybe we should all give Jack a run for his money, or rather for Joe's." In May, with Kennedy out in front after an upset victory over Hubert Humphrey in West Virginia, Truman announced his support for Missouri's own Symington, calling him, without doubt, the best qualified for the presidency. Asked what objections he had to Kennedy, Truman said, "None whatever. He's a fine young man, and I know and like him. The only thing is, he lives in Massachusetts." Atchison grew greatly concerned that Truman might now go on the attack against Kennedy and say things that could cause long-lasting harm, not only about Kennedy but about civil rights. For lately, Truman had been expressing views that left many feeling chagrined and disappointed, and especially those who knew how committed he was to equality before the law. Truman strongly disapproved of the methods of the civil rights movement, the sit-ins and marches. The leaders of the movement, it seemed to him, were flouting the law, resorting to mob rule, which was not his idea of the right way to bring about progress. He also appeared to take seriously the view of J. Edgar Hoover that much of the movement was communist-inspired. On June 27th, his greatest admirer and most devoted friend, Dean Atchison, wrote to set him straight in no uncertain terms and to ask him to agree to a few specific don'ts concerning the weeks ahead. It was a remarkable letter attesting not only to Atchison's exceptional skill and value as an advisor, but to the confidence he had in the strength of their friendship. Dear Boss, as the convention approaches, we partisans are likely to become, shall we say, emphatic in our statements to the press. Could we make a treaty on what we shall not say? On the positive side, we can and doubtless will say that our candidate, yours and mine, has all the virtues of the greats from Pericles through Churchill. St. Peter and people forgive this innocent, though improbable, hyperbole. But there are some things that no one should and few will forgive. These fall into several groups, but the common denominator is the harm that comes from allowing the intensity of the personal view to dim a proper concern for the common cause. The list of the "it's not dones," as I see it, goes like this. 1. About other Democratic candidates. A. Never say that any of them is not qualified to be president. B. Never say that any of them can't win. C. Never suggest that any of them is the tool of any group or interest, or is not a true blue liberal, or has used more money than another. The reason? At this point, public argument is too late. Deals may still be possible. I just don't know. But sounding off is sure to be wrong. If our candidate is going anywhere, which I doubt, it will not be because of public attacks on other candidates, and such attacks can do a lot of harm when they are quoted in the election campaign. 2. About the Negro sit-in strikes. A. Do not say that they are communist-inspired. The evidence is all the other way, despite alleged views of J. Edgar Hoover, whom you should trust as much as you would a rattlesnake with the silencer on its rattle. B. Do not say that you disapprove of them. Whatever you think, you are under no compulsion to broadcast it. Free speech is a restraint on government, not an incitement to the citizen. The reason? Your views, as reported, are wholly out of keeping with your public record. The discussion does not convince anyone of anything. If you want to discuss the sociological, moral, and legal interests involved, you should give much more time and thought to them. 3. About foreign policy. A. For the next 4 months, do not say that in foreign policy we must support the president. The reason? This cliché has become a menace. It misrepresents by creating the false belief that in the recent disasters the president has had a policy or position to support. This just isn't true. One might as well say support the president if he falls off the end of a dock. That isn't a policy. But to urge support for him makes his predicament appear to be a policy to people who don't know what a dock is. So please, for just 4 months, let his apologists come to his aid. We have got to beat Nixon. We shall probably have to do it with Kennedy. Why make it any harder than it has to be? Now, if ever, our vocal cords ought to be played on the keyboard of our minds. This is so hard for me that I have stopped using my chords at all. By August they will be ready to play My Rosary, so I offer you a treaty on don'ts. Will you agree? In reply, Truman wrote, You'll never know how very much I appreciated your call and your good letter. I tried my best to profit by both, thanks to a real friend and a real standby. When it appeared that Kennedy already had the nomination in hand, Truman kept insisting it would be an open convention, and by inference, one he would influence if not control. A bandwagon only begins to roll after the 3rd or 4th ballot, he told reporters. He was greatly looking forward to the convention. I'm going to Los Angeles and make the best fight I can, he wrote to Agnes Meyer, wife of the owner of the Washington Post. I'm not a pessimist, and always fight until the last dog dies. In reality, Kennedy had all but settled the matter, as Truman's ever-devoted advisers Hillman and Noyes reported to him from Los Angeles. The game was over. Your coming here is considered routine and not calculated to make any significant change. This is the judgment of even those who are partial to you. But they urged him to say nothing about the convention being rigged, or you will be charged with November defeat, a prospect that seems all but certain. But Truman, angry, bitter, would speak his mind. On July 2nd, at a dramatic televised press conference at the Truman Library, he lashed out at Kennedy in a way certain to infuriate a great many Democrats, exactly as Atchison had urged him never to do. He not only announced he would not attend the convention as a delegate because the Kennedy forces had it rigged, but facing the television cameras leveled his remarks directly at Kennedy. Senator, are you certain that you are quite ready for the country, or that the country is ready for you in the role of president in January 1961? He had no doubt, Truman said, about the political heights to which Kennedy was destined to rise. But I am deeply concerned and troubled about the situation we are up against in the world now and in the immediate future. That is why I hope that someone with the greatest possible maturity and experience would be available at this time. May I urge you to be patient? Kennedy responded quickly and smoothly. If 14 years in major elective office was insufficient experience, he said, then that would have ruled out all but a handful of presidents, including Wilson, Roosevelt, and Truman. No one applauded Truman for what he had done. Atchison wrote to him after the convention, I listened to your press conference and regretted that you felt impelled to say anything, though what you said was better than what you first told me that you intended to say. It seemed quite inevitable that Jack's nomination would occur, and that all you and Lyndon said you would both have to eat, as indeed you have. Poor Lyndon came off much worse, since he is now in the crate on the way to the county fair and destined to be a younger and more garrulous, if that is possible, Alban Barkley. It is possible that being a smart operator in the Senate is a special brand of smartness which doesn't carry over into the larger field. Jack and his team were the only pros in Los Angeles, so far as I could see. Well, we're off to the races. I hope it is still true that the Lord looks benignly after children, drunks, and the USA. Again, as in 1956, Truman was ready to join forces and do his part. When Kennedy called him from Hyannisport on August 2nd, he said at once that he was ready to help. He could not have been kinder to me, Kennedy remarked privately. Truman's own disappointment and anger had to be put aside. He was blue as indigo over what had happened at Los Angeles, he wrote in a letter to Atchison that he decided not to send. The choice of Kennedy or Nixon was a bleak prospect. You and I are stuck with the necessity of taking the worst of two evils or none at all, so I'm taking the immature Democrat as the best of the two. Nixon is impossible, so there we are. Accompanied by Stuart Symington, Kennedy came to the Truman Library, where Truman, who was old enough to be Kennedy's father, met him at the door. "Come right on in here, young man. I want to talk to you." 2 days later, Truman wrote to Sam Rosenman, "Don't get discouraged. The boy is learning, I hope." To the surprise of no one who knew him, Truman joined the campaign. The Kennedy-Nixon contest of 1960 was to be his last hurrah, as assuredly he knew, and he pitched in for all he was worth. "Now you are in for it," wrote Atchison. "Just don't exhaust yourself through sheer nonsense." Traveling by plane, train, and automobile, Truman covered 9 states, delivered 13 speeches. He rode in parades, held press conferences, shook hands, waved, smiled, kept everyone with him on the run, and as always thrived on it. The one thing he insisted on was his midday nap. "A nap after lunch is imperative and cannot be missed under any consideration," his aide David Stowe was instructed. Only in overcrowded rooms, when people began pushing and shoving to meet him, did he show the strain. "Although he moves into and through situations with the same good humor and smiles," wrote Stowe in his notes, "apparently this problem bothers him to some extent because it became a frequent topic of conversation. Conceivably, it is a warning to those who work with him to be on our toes to avoid, in our planning, any large gatherings in which he can be mauled and shoved around. After all, he is 76. "The campaign has ended and we have a Catholic for president," Truman wrote to Atchison on November 21st. "It makes no difference, in my opinion, what church a man belongs to, if he believes in the oath he takes to support and defend the Constitution. If our new president works on the job, he'll have no trouble. You know, I wish I'd been young enough to go back to the White House and make Alibi Ike wear a top hat." The day after Kennedy's inauguration in January 1961, Truman was welcomed back to the White House and the Oval Office for the first time in 8 years, for which, as he wrote the president, he was extremely grateful. The following November, the Trumans and Margaret and Clifton Daniel were guests at the White House for a white-tie dinner in Truman's honor and for an overnight visit. The grouse served at dinner was so tough as to be nearly inedible, but with many of his old cabinet assembled for the occasion, and with the hospitality shown by the President and First Lady, Truman was radiant. For the after-dinner entertainment in the East Room, the Kennedys had arranged a piano concert of Truman's favorites, Mozart and Chopin, played by Eugene Liszt, who had first performed for Truman at Potsdam. When, at one point, Liszt invited the former president to take a turn at the big Steinway, Truman obliged, looking as pleased as a man could possibly be. 4. With the passing of time, old political wounds began to fade. Truman made amends, restored friendship with one former adversary or critic after another. Henry Wallace, Joe Martin, Joe Alsop, Drew Pearson, even Paul Hume, the Washington Post music critic who came to Kansas City to review a concert of Maria Callas and decided to drive out to the Truman Library. As Hume later recounted, he and Truman had a wonderful visit, Truman taking an hour to talk and show him about the library. "I've had a lot of fun out of you and General MacArthur over the years," Truman said as Hume was leaving. "I hope you don't mind." At the concert that night, Hume found himself sitting across the aisle from the Trumans. When he went over to say hello, Truman turned to Bess and said, "See, I told you that Paul Hume was in my office today." Following the performance, Truman went backstage to meet Maria Callas, and later, catching up with friends, walking to their cars in the garage across the street, Truman, looking tremendously pleased, said, "You know, she remembered me." Only 3 remained for whom he had little or nothing good to say: Eisenhower, MacArthur, and Richard Nixon. The man he had hated most, Joe McCarthy, was dead of acute alcoholism at age 48 in 1957. In November 1961, at Sam Rayburn's funeral in Bonham, Texas, with 20,000 people standing in the cold outside the packed church, Truman was seated with both Kennedy and Eisenhower, all 3 in the same front pew, Truman and Eisenhower looking, as the nation saw on television, like very elder statesmen indeed next to the young president. For Truman, with his fond memories of Rayburn, it was a particularly painful ceremony, but like the Marshall funeral, it was another step in what was becoming a slow but steady reconciliation with Eisenhower. For 8 years, Truman had hoped Eisenhower would sometime call on him for advice or ask him to take on a project, as Truman had asked Herbert Hoover, but it had never happened. Nor did it now with Kennedy, and Truman felt terribly let down. "You are making a contribution," he told Atchison, who was being called on by Kennedy for advice. "I am not. Wish I could." The morning walks continued, though he went accompanied now by a bodyguard, a big, solid-looking Independence police officer in plain clothes named Mike Westwood, who was being paid by the town and would stay at Truman's side in all seasons. His chief pleasures remained constant: his books, his library, his correspondence with Atchison, his family. To Clifton Daniel he was the ideal father-in-law, just great, never interfering, always considerate. "Give him hell Harry didn't give anybody hell at home," Daniel would remember. Needless to say, I was always respectful of him, both as a father-in-law and a former president. In public I addressed him as Mr. President, and in private, after our first son was born, as Grandpa. Before, I avoided calling him anything whenever I could. It would have made us both uncomfortable for me to say Dad, and for his generation and mine, Harry was unthinkable. I used Sir as much as possible. In the summer of 1961, Truman had begun work on what was to be a series of television films about the presidency, but dealing primarily with his own years in the White House. It was still another effort, like the memoirs in the Truman Library, intended to educate the country, and especially young Americans. "I'm mostly interested in children," he often said. The films were to be produced and financed by David Susskind and his company, Talent Associates. The writer and general organizer of the project was Merle Miller, a novelist and former reporter for Yank, who had been chosen not only to add a creative spark, but because it was felt that he and the former president had much in common. Miller, too, had grown up in the Midwest, a book-loving boy with eyeglasses and early dreams of glory. But more important and influential than the films that eventually resulted was the portrait that Miller would compile from recorded conversations with Truman in a book called Plain Speaking, a book that would not be published for another dozen years. Ironically, because of his background, Miller had not expected to like Truman, imagining him to be far too much like people he had known growing up in Marshalltown, Iowa. "I had thought he was not what we want in a president," Miller remembered. "I think we want in a president something somewhat regal." But here, he remembered, was an extraordinarily intelligent, informed human being. If I had a father who was smart, or if I had a father who read a book, if I had a father who knew how to get along with people, this was he. How could you not like him? He was such a decent human being with concern, a genuine concern, for your welfare. "Well, how are you? How's your hotel? How's the food?" He wanted to make you comfortable, and he did make you comfortable. I never had an uncomfortable moment with him, except toward the end when it appeared that there was never going to be a show. With Truman, Miller felt, you could reach out and there was somebody there. There was a person there. He was there for you. The producer assigned to the series, Robert Allen Arthur, found Truman brisk, opinionated, and during one morning session, Arthur thought possibly more fortified with bourbon than ever the doctor ordered. "Don't try to make a play actor out of me," Truman insisted to them. A day of shooting was arranged at the Army Command and General Staff School at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Truman was to sit with a selected group of officers and talk about Korea. Everyone had expected Truman to be at his best in such a setting, with nothing rehearsed. Instead, he was terrible, as Robert Arthur remembered. Truman was told how good he had been, but clearly he knew better. "You're trying to make a play actor out of me, and it won't work." Using a tape recorder, Miller and Arthur spent hours, eventually days, interviewing Truman. The stories, the pithy observations came pouring forth. Listening to him, Merle Miller thought Truman had been ill-served by those who had worked with him on the memoirs. I think there were people, Noyes and Hillman being foremost among them, who wanted to make him something he wasn't, largely dull. Truman still told stories wonderfully and with an infectious enjoyment. He was also inclined to exaggerate, even invent. Miller was reminded of Huck Finn's comment about Mark Twain. He told the truth, mainly. There were things which he stretched, but mainly he told the truth. Truman described the old Democratic picnics at Lone Jack and the oratorical mannerism of the old-time politicians, and particularly Colonel Crisp, who had said, "God damn an eyewitness, he always spoils a good story." He described seeing William Jennings Bryan sitting at lunch in Kansas City with a bowl full of radishes and a plate of butter. He'd just sit there buttering the radishes and eating them, ate the whole bowl. When Miller asked if he ever identified with Huck Finn or Tom Sawyer when growing up, "No," Truman said, "I wasn't in that class. I was kind of a sissy when growing up." Wearing glasses, he said, makes a kid lonely and he has to fight for everything he wants. Oh, well, you had to be either intellectually above the others or do more work than they did. Then you have to be careful not to lord it over those that you've defeated in that line. He talked of political bosses. The boss is not the boss unless he has the majority of the people with him. He talked of Franklin Roosevelt. He had something like Bryan had. He could make people believe what he wanted to do was right. He told the story of the Chicago Convention of 1944, recounting how he had felt when he put down the telephone in Bob Hannigan's room after talking to Roosevelt, and described how the others in the room looked, waiting to hear what he would do. "I walked around there for about 5 minutes, and you should have seen the faces of those birds. They were just worried to beat hell." He described how, during the 1944 campaign, he had threatened to throw Joe Kennedy out the window of the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Boston when Kennedy kept maligning Roosevelt. "I haven't seen him since." But then he warned Miller not to use the story, because his son's President of the United States and he's a grand boy. An optimist was a person who thinks things can be done. No pessimist ever did anything for the world. Billy Graham said the end of the world was coming, but Truman didn't believe it. Courtesy mattered greatly to him. He had heard a story of a gas attendant who refused to fill Tom Dewey's tank, and Truman strongly disapproved. Later he would chide the press for calling the First Lady Jackie. The great men of the Roman Republic were not military men, he said. Hadrian was the greatest. His own favorite, however, was Marcus Aurelius, who thought always of the welfare of his people. Listened to long afterward, the tapes would be extremely difficult to follow, full of static, full of the sound of other voices in Truman's office, as people came and went. His own voice was strong, lower and more appealing than his platform voice. Often everyone would break into laughter. The mood was one of a good time, good fellowship, and clearly Truman delighted in it. Unlike the day at Fort Leavenworth, some of the filming sessions went extremely well. His answers came back rich with detail and with all the sharp authority of the man who'd been there, remembered Robert Arthur of one particularly good session in New York. 2 or 3 times it was Mr. Truman who asked for another try, saying he could do better. When at one point concern was voiced over whether the president was wearing the same necktie as he had during previous sessions in Independence, Truman asked if that really mattered. "Because if while I'm talking about Korea people are asking each other about my necktie, it seems to me we're in a great deal of trouble." To Miller and Arthur, he seemed exceptionally alert and fit. His first impression, Miller remembered, was, "My God, he's not old at all." But in fact, Truman had begun to slow down, even slip a little. To those who had worked with him at the White House, those who had known him from years past in Independence and Kansas City, he was noticeably different from the man he had been. He moved with less authority. He had become slightly hard of hearing. Responding to questions, he was often inclined to give a quick, abrasive answer for effect, an old man's wisecrack. He had been asked so many of the same questions so often in recent years that he had developed a set of pat answers that sounded no better than pat answers. Sometimes he talked as if quoting his own books or old speeches. Other times, and only in the company of men, he used more profanity than in days past. And while the famous smile, the cheerful, personable demeanor remained, his private disdain of certain people and trends of the moment was greater than ever before. He hated the fashion of long hair on young men and greatly disliked being called senior citizen. Asked if he thought there would ever be an expedition to the moon, he said probably, but he could not imagine why. In private, every once in a while, he could revert still to old habits of the mouth as if he were not aware of what he was saying. "People in Independence haven't changed a darn bit," he remarked at one point. He had nothing against Mormons, he told Miller. They were exceedingly hard-working people. But a lot of old-timers in town hate them just as bad as they ever did, Truman said, and for the same reason some people hate to eat at the same table with a nigger. It was prejudice, he said. He worried about the mounting national debt and this poor broke government of ours. He intensely disapproved of what he saw happening to politics because of television. "I don't like counterfeits, and the radio and television make counterfeits out of these politicians." He hated to see the town being swallowed up by tract houses, billboards, gas stations, and traffic. And ironically, sadly, It was the automobile and the highway, two of the loves of his life, causing the change. Most mornings now he had to stop and pick up litter, beer cans and candy wrappers, thrown into his front yard. His lingering anger over General MacArthur seemed excessive. There were times, Merle Miller remembered, when you wanted to say to him, "Look, you know you had the last word. Leave it lay and bask in your triumph." Of Eisenhower, he could hardly say anything without resorting to profanity. But then Kennedy, too, seemed nearly as misguided to him as had Eisenhower. Truman was utterly appalled by the Bay of Pigs fiasco, as was Atchison. There was an unfortunate preoccupation at the Kennedy White House with image, Atchison wrote to Truman. This is a terrible weakness. It makes one look at oneself instead of at the problem. How will I look fielding this hot line drive to shortstop? This is a good way to miss the ball altogether. I'm amazed looking back to how far you were from this. I don't remember a case where you stopped to think of the effect on your fortunes, or the party's for that matter, of a decision in foreign policy. Keep writing, Truman replied. It keeps my morale up, if I have any. You must remember our head of state is young, inexperienced, and hopeful, he told Atchison in another letter. Let's hope the hopeful works. Hearing that the Democratic Party, at Kennedy's suggestion, was going to put on a $1,000-a-plate dinner, Truman was appalled. If, as and when that happens, we'll just quit being Democrats with a little d. Nobody had consulted him on the matter. To hell with these millionaires at the head of things. Of Attorney General Robert Kennedy, he said, I just don't like that boy, and I never will. In May of 1960, Matt Connolly had begun serving a prison sentence for income tax evasion. Convinced of Connolly's innocence, and like others convinced that Connolly was being made the victim of a Republican vendetta, Truman had done all he could, including helping to raise money to defray Connolly's legal expenses. In March 1961, he had written to Bobby Kennedy to urge a pardon for Connolly, who was by then out of prison on parole. But Kennedy had responded by saying only that he was studying the problem. In May, Truman wrote again, providing more detailed background information, and again Kennedy guaranteed his personal attention. But nothing happened, and by the start of 1962, a furious Truman wrote in longhand to the Attorney General, Matt Connolly has been abused and mistreated, as I told you in my original letter. I want him pardoned and his full rights restored. I've never spoken to your brother about this, and I don't intend to. But if you think that I enjoy mistreatment and injustice to one of my best employees, you are mistaken. So don't smile at me anymore unless you want to do justice to Matt Connolly, which is the right thing, a full pardon. In November 1962, Connolly was pardoned by President Kennedy, and it was to the President that Truman sent his letter of gratitude. Bess, who had been suffering increasingly with arthritis in her knees and hands, had discovered a lump in her breast. Although it was found to be benign, it had invaded the lymph nodes, and Wallace Graham performed a mastectomy. The ordeal had been extremely distressing for Truman, who was also later hospitalized in January 1963 to be operated on for an intestinal hernia, a little butchering, as he said. In fact, it was an extremely serious operation for someone his age, and he was a long time recovering. The man who had always loved clocks, who on restless nights had wound the clocks at the White House and kept 8 or 9 in the Oval Office, who had always wanted to be on time wherever he went, now saw time as the enemy, the pursuer. That old lady Anno Domini has been chasing me, and I have to slow up a little bit, he wrote to Atchison, particularly since she has a partner in Mrs. Truman. All 3 of Bess's younger brothers, Frank, George, and Fred Wallace, were dead by now. At 79, you go to funeral after funeral of your friends, most of whom are younger than 79, and you sometimes wonder if the old man with the scythe isn't after you, Truman said in another letter in May 1963, following his birthday. The murder of John F. Kennedy that fall left him feeling devastated. He had been having lunch at the Mulebach when he heard the news that Kennedy had been shot, but it was not until later in his car driving home that he learned that Kennedy was dead. Having come so close to that fate himself, wrote Margaret, Dad was terribly shaken by it. For the first time in his life he was unable to face reporters. As I was preparing to fly to Washington, Truman later wrote in reply to a query from the author William Manchester, I received a call from President Johnson telling me that a plane was being sent for me, and I was able to arrive the day before the funeral. I went directly to Blair House. Shortly after arriving there, we rode over to the White House to call on Mrs. Kennedy. I found her as I expected, remarkably self-possessed and poised, but to me the deep sadness in her eyes came through. She said to me her husband, the President, spoke of me often and with much feeling and understanding of what we tried to do, and I found myself choked up with emotion. It is difficult for one who has lived through the presidency and the trials and burdens that go with it not to realize the enormity of the tragedy that had befallen the nation and the tragic blow that was visited on his family, and particularly the wife of the president. Bess had been ill and unable to make the trip. Margaret and Clifton had come down from New York to stay with Truman at Blair House. Seeing her father, Margaret grew concerned. He looked dreadful. A doctor was sent for. Truman obediently went upstairs to his room and was served his dinner in bed. But he was back on his feet the next day to attend the funeral and graveside services, after which he returned to Blair House in the same car with the Eisenhowers. For about an hour in the front parlor at Blair House, the two men sat talking. Then Eisenhower returned to his home in Gettysburg, and Truman flew back to Missouri. In the aftermath of the Kennedy tragedy, a bill was passed by Congress authorizing Secret Service protection for former presidents, and so a Secret Service detail arrived in Independence. But when one of the agents called at the Truman House to introduce himself and told the president he would no longer have a need for his own bodyguard, Mike Westwood, Truman told him, "Well, I no longer have a need for you, so get out of here." Neither of the Trumans had any wish for the Secret Service to return to their lives. Margaret described her mother reacting as if they had just told her she was going to have to spend 4 more years in the White House. Bess, too, refused to allow the agents on the property, but then President Johnson personally telephoned one evening and convinced Bess that the Secret Service should be reinstated, and the Trumans agreed. They were to be watched over from then on, though Mike Westwood continued accompanying the president as before. Celebrations of Truman's 80th birthday in May 1964 went on for more than a week in Independence, Kansas City, and Washington. There was a huge lunch in his honor in Independence and another at the Mulebach. In Washington on May 8th, he celebrated with characteristic verve and vinegar, drawing cheers and praise wherever he went. Invited to address the Senate, he sat in a front seat, a rose in his lapel, and listened to glowing tributes from 27 senators, including 2 of his favorites from his own years in the Senate, Republicans George Aiken and Leverett Saltonstall. It was an historic occasion, the first time the Senate was making use of a new rule adopted the year before, whereby former presidents could be granted the privilege of the floor, a point that Truman felt so deeply that when he rose he was scarcely able to speak. "Thank you very much. I am so overcome that I cannot take advantage of this rule right now. It is one of the greatest things that has ever happened to me in my whole lifetime. It is unique. It is something that has never been done before, and between you and me and the gatepost, since I profit by it, I think it is a good rule. You can wish me many more happy birthdays, but I'll never have another one like this," he said, as senators crowded about him to shake his hand. 5 months later, on October 13, 1964, Truman tripped on the sill going into the upstairs bathroom at 219 North Delaware. He fell, cracking his head against the wash basin, his glasses shattering and cutting him badly over the right eye. He then fell against the bathtub, fracturing 2 ribs. Though still conscious, he was unable to move. The police were called, and he was taken to the hospital in an ambulance. 2 days later, Wallace Graham reported that his patient was much improved, his condition very satisfactory. But though Truman was soon home again and eventually returned to something like his old routine, he never fully recovered from the fall. He began losing weight, his face becoming drawn, the eyes behind the thick glasses appearing disproportionately large. "He doesn't look a thing like he used to," his sister Mary Jane said. "He always had a full face and always looked so well. He takes a miserable picture now, he is so thin. He's always taken such a nice picture." Yet on he went, taking his morning walks with Mike Westwood, or on occasion with Thomas Melton, pastor of the First Presbyterian Church, who lived just across Truman Road. The pace a little slower each year, but Truman doing most of the talking, as Melton remembered. Passing an enormous ginkgo tree on Maple Street, one of the largest, most spectacular trees in town, Truman would customarily speak to it, too. "And what would the president say to the tree?" Melton would be asked by a visitor years later. He would say, "You're doing a good job." He and Bess became steady patrons of the Independence Public Library. In another new Chrysler, this a light green model, Mike Westwood would drive them, Truman riding in front, Bess in back. At the library, she would go in and return with an armload of books. The correspondence with Atchison also continued, Atchison writing at length to keep Truman posted on the Johnson presidency as he knew Truman wanted. But Truman dictated his letters now and had less and less to say. In the summer of 1965, Vivian Truman died at age 79. "His passing has meant a great loss to me," Truman told Atchison. Within days, Ted Marks, too, was dead, and Truman attended both funerals. When on July 30th, 1965, President Johnson came to Independence to sign the new Medicare bill in Truman's presence at the Truman Library, There was, in the words of one account, sad amazement expressed in the large Washington contingent over Truman's pitifully frail appearance. His voice, however, remained firm, and he talked of several projects he planned for the library. Sitting at Johnson's elbow, a cane in his lap, he watched the signing into law of legislation for health care for the aged, such as he had proposed 20 years before. "You have made me a very, very happy man," Truman told the president. Nellie Noland died, and Jim Pendergast. Among the private sorrows of Truman's final years had been a falling out with his old friend Jim Pendergast. There had been a misunderstanding in 1958 over the endorsement of a local Democratic candidate, which left each of them convinced the other had betrayed their friendship. It was a sad, unfortunate impasse, and when Jim Pendergast, after a long battle with cancer, died in the spring of 1966, Truman, who attended the funeral, knew another chapter of his life was closed, and not at all as he wished. Attending funerals had become a part of his life. Thomas Melton, the Presbyterian pastor, would later recount an unforgettable graveside scene one grim winter day in Independence. "Quite often we have committals for people who are not from this area when they die. It was in February, if I recall correctly, and it was very cold and bitter, a lot of snow that year. And we were going to have a committal at the city cemetery, so I went to the appointed place. There was no one there but the undertaker, no pallbearers, and we thought we'd wait until the appointed time, as announced in the newspapers, in case anybody would come. In came this green Chrysler, and I recognized the car immediately. I knew it was Mr. Truman's car. The Secret Service man got out and stood in his position, and Mr. Truman walked over to the bier, and I was amazed. I went ahead with the committal. Snow was still in the air, cold. After I had my benediction, I asked him, I said, 'Mr. President, why are you here? It's cold and bitter. Did you know this gentleman?' And he said, 'Pastor, I never forget a friend.' And I was just speechless. This was the President of the United States." Lyndon Johnson came to Independence several times again, hoping to enlist Truman's endorsement of the war in Vietnam. But Truman, who as president had first pledged American support for the French against Ho Chi Minh, made no statement about the war. Privately, he had become more and more disillusioned with Johnson's leadership. In 1967, in his 84th year, Truman stopped coming to the library on a regular basis. Nothing was said in explanation. He was just not there much anymore. When in early 1969 the new president, Richard Nixon, expressed a desire to come see Truman, he and Bess agreed. The president and first lady called at 219 North Delaware on March 22nd. They were with the Trumans for a half an hour, then drove to the library where Truman, who was not having one of his best days, stood expressionless while Nixon, at a concert grand piano outside Truman's office, played the Missouri Waltz. To many who were present and who knew how much Truman disliked the song, it was a difficult moment. But when Nixon finished, Truman turned to Bess and asked what it was he had played. Margaret and Clifton Daniel had had 2 more children by now, Harrison and Thomas, making a family of 4 sons. Twice with the Daniels in late March 1968 and again the same time the next year, the Trumans returned to Key West, where with the 4 boys, Grandpa would be seen walking the streets of the old town, wearing a blue blazer and a baseball cap, enjoying the air and sunshine as in times past. These would be remembered as among the happiest weeks for all of them. He felt damn good for an old man, Truman told reporters. But he had been hospitalized for the flu that winter and was beginning to feel like the last leaf on the tree. Adlai Stevenson, Churchill, Douglas MacArthur were all dead. During the stay at Key West came the news of the death of Eisenhower. Truman wrote a gracious tribute. On June 28, 1969, the Trumans celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary at home. There was no party, only a few friends dropped by. As Bess explained to reporters, the president was not up to standing for a long time shaking hands. Once in 1913, writing from the farmhouse at Grandview, he had told her, "It seems a hollow week if I don't arrive at 219 Delaware at least one day in it." Now there were few days that he did not spend there. His books became his life more and more. Cars passing on Truman Road, neighbors out for a walk in the evening, could see him in the window sitting with a book under his reading lamp. What would her father's idea of heaven have been, Margaret would be asked years later. Oh, she said, to have a good comfortable chair, a good reading lamp, and lots of books around that he wanted to read. Once in New York, when Ken McCormick of Doubleday had called on him early in the morning at his hotel, Truman had been sitting in a chair in the bedroom with several new books stacked on a table beside him. Did the president like to read himself to sleep at night? McCormick asked. "No, young man," said Truman. "I like to read myself awake." Thomas Hart Benton came to the house to sketch the frail old figure in his chair with his books, and the drawing Benton made was one few Americans would have recognized as Harry Truman. Benton thought there was more character in the face now. "I was greatly pleased by your kind and generous letter on my 87th birthday," Truman wrote to Atchison on May 14, 1971. "Coming from you, this carries a much deeper meaning for me." The signature was still recognizable as his own, but just barely. Ethel Noland died that summer. Then on Tuesday, October 12th, at his farm in Sandy Spring, Maryland, Atchison was found slumped over a desk in his study, dead of a heart attack at age 78. "Oh, no," Bess Truman said when called by the New York Times. Mr. Truman, she said, would have no immediate comment, but added, "I know he'll be very disturbed." The summer of 1972, Truman was hospitalized, first after another fall, then for 2 weeks with gastrointestinal troubles. Late the afternoon of Tuesday, December 5th, he was taken again to the hospital, leaving the house on North Delaware by ambulance for the last time. His condition, as given to reporters at Research Hospital by Wallace Graham that night, was fair. He was suffering from lung congestion. On December 6th, his condition listed as critical, bulletins were issued throughout the day. The doctors were trying to unclog his lung with antibiotics and oxygen, but were hampered because the former president was also suffering from bronchitis, and because hardening of the arteries was causing his heart to race periodically. Margaret, who was in Washington for a reception celebrating her new book about her father, Harry S. Truman, flew to Kansas City immediately in a White House jet provided by President Nixon. In another few days, Truman appeared to rally and was taken off the critical list. But as his battle went on, Wallace Graham could say only that his condition was very serious. Bess and Margaret were with him daily in his room on the 6th floor. Mary Jane Truman dropped by. She, too, was a patient in the hospital, having injured herself in a fall several weeks before. Truman was reported awake and smiling. Asked how he was feeling, he answered, "Better." There were Christmas decorations in his window, reporters were told. Mrs. Truman remained in good spirits. "He smiled at us and gave yes and no answers to our questions," Margaret told the press on December 10th. On the night of December 11th, when asked how he felt, Truman reportedly said, "I feel all right." Asked if he hurt anywhere, he said, "No." On December 14th, he was reported no longer able to talk. The struggle went on for 3 weeks, during which Margaret returned to her family in New York. By now he was suffering from lung congestion, heart irregularity, kidney blockages, and a failing digestive system. One of the special duty nurses who had been with him as his night nurse since he was first admitted on December 5th, Mrs. Walter Kalili, described him later as warm, sweet, and most appreciative of anything you did for him. On Sunday morning, December 24th, her night duty ended, she leaned over to tell him she was to have the night off, Christmas Eve, and asked him if he would be there when she got back. "He squeezed my hand," she later said, "which leads me to believe his mind was still responsive." On Christmas Eve, he grew progressively weaker. On Christmas morning, he was reported in a deep coma and near death. Margaret arrived by plane from New York. A 2 p.m. bulletin reported his condition unimproved, and the hospital's chief of staff, Warren F. Wilhelm, called his chances of survival very, very small. Asked why Mr. Truman was being kept alive this long, Dr. Wilhelm replied, "It's an ethical question. Who would decide? You can always hope that he will rally." Bess, who had been staying overnight in the hospital and was with her husband through most of every day, had reached a point of almost total exhaustion. Greatly concerned, Margaret persuaded her mother to go home with her to Independence that Christmas night. "Dad was in a coma, and there was nothing we could do to help him." Truman died in Kansas City's Research Hospital and Medical Center on Tuesday, December 26, 1972, at 7:50 a.m. Central Standard Time. An elaborate 5-day state funeral had been planned years before, with everything to be conducted by the Fifth Army from Fort Sam Houston, Texas. O-Plan Missouri, as it was called, ran to several hundred pages, with everything specified in elaborate detail. Originally, Truman's body was to be flown to Washington to lie in state in the rotunda of the Capitol, then returned to Missouri for burial. As it was, in the 3 weeks when he lay dying in the hospital, the Army's aging Blackjack, the horse that had become such a symbol of tragedy for the nation during the Kennedy state funeral, was taken up in a plane several times to prepare him for the flight to Missouri. Truman had been shown the entire plan one day in his office at the library and approved nearly all of it, subject to changes his family might wish. He thought it sounded like a fine show and was sorry to have to miss it, he said. He objected only to lying in state in Washington. He wanted to be buried out there, he had said, turning in his chair to look into the courtyard. I want to be out there so I can get up and walk into my office if I want to. But the funeral on December 27th was greatly reduced in scale to be more what Bess wanted. Keep it simple, she told Margaret and Clifton Daniel. Even so, the military presence was to be substantial, as several thousand troops arrived in Independence to take part in the ceremonies. After a private service for the family at Carson's funeral home, the body was taken to lie in state in the lobby of the Truman Library, the hearse moving slowly through the streets of the town, along Lexington, River Boulevard, Maple, and North Delaware, all lined with soldiers. An honor guard was posted at the library steps. 6 howitzers lined the front lawn. President and Mrs. Nixon came to pay their respects and to place a wreath of red, white, and blue carnations on the casket. Lyndon Johnson was present with all of his family. Johnson, who looked gaunt and greatly aged, would himself die just 3 weeks later. For the rest of the day and through the night and on into the morning, thousands of people, 75,000 people it would be estimated, passed by the closed casket in the lobby of the Truman Library in front of the Benton mural. The line stretched half a mile to beyond the highway. This whole town was a friend of Harry's, one man told a reporter. That afternoon, Thursday, December 28th, as he had wished, Truman was buried in the courtyard of the library. With space for the service in the library auditorium limited, only 250 people were invited. Among those present were Averell Harriman, Clark Clifford, Charlie Murphy, Rose Conway, Harry Vaughn, and Sam Rosenman. Bess Truman, Margaret and Clifton and their 4 sons sat behind a green curtain, screened from the others. It was an Episcopal service, as Bess wished, though a Masonic rite was included and a Baptist minister read a prayer. There was no eulogy, no hymns were sung. Outside, afterward, at the gravesite, it was cold and raw, and as the howitzers roared a 21-gun salute and taps was sounded, the day seemed to turn dramatically colder still. Later there was snow in the air, and a few of the library staff would remember standing at a window looking out into the empty court and feeling great sympathy, as assuredly Truman would have too, for the men who were working in the cold and dark to fill in the grave. 5. He was not a hero, or a magician, or a chess player, or an obsession. He was a certifiable member of the human race, direct, fallible, and unexpectedly wise when it counted, wrote Mary McGrory in the Washington Star the next day, in one of hundreds of published tributes. He did not require to be loved. He did not expect to be followed blindly. Congressional opposition never struck him as subversive, nor did he regard his critics as traitors. He never whined. He walked around Washington every morning. It was safe then. He met reporters frequently as a matter of course and did not blame them for his failures. He did not use the office as a club or a shield or a hiding place. He worked at it. He said he lived by the Bible and history. So armed, he proved that the ordinary American is capable of grandeur, and that a president can be a human being. He was remembered in print and over the airwaves, in the halls of Congress and in large parts of the world, as a figure of courage and principle. Even Time and the Wall Street Journal, publications that had often scorned him in years past, acclaimed him now as one of the great figures of the century. The obituary in the New York Times ran 7 pages. When the writer, Alden Whitman of the Times, had been preparing it in advance years before and went to Independence to interview Truman himself, feeling extremely uneasy about the whole assignment, Truman greeted him with a smile, saying, "I know why you're here, and I want to help you all I can." In a day of memorial tributes in the Senate chamber that he so loved, he was eulogized as the president who had faced the momentous decision of whether to use the atomic bomb, praised for the creation of the United Nations, for the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, the Berlin Airlift, the recognition of Israel, NATO, for committing American forces in Korea, and for upholding the principle of civilian control over the military, decisions many of us would pale before, said Senator William Proxmire of Wisconsin. He was remembered as the first president to recommend Medicare, remembered for the courage of his stand on civil rights at the risk of his political fortunes. The Whistle Stop campaign was recalled as one of the affirming moments in the history of the American political system. His lack of glamour, the cronies and loud Florida shirts, the angry letters, and the taint of the Truman scandals seemed to fade in memory. The scandals, squalid as they were, would with time appear almost tame, in contrast to the corrupt excesses of later administrations. The frequently quoted view of Sam Rayburn that Truman was right on all the big decisions, wrong on all the little ones, was hardly accurate. His loyalty program, a very large decision, had been woefully wrong, as was the appointment of Lewis Johnson, as was the high-handed seizure of the steel industry, while the restoration of Herbert Hoover to public service and public esteem was not only a right and generous small decision, but one that said much about Truman's essential human quality. That he would later be held accountable by some critics for the treacheries and overbearing influence of the CIA, as well as for the Vietnam War, was understandable but unjustified. He never intended the CIA to become what it did. His decisions concerning Vietnam by no means predetermined all that followed under later very different presidents. His insistence that the war in Korea be kept in bounds, kept from becoming a nuclear nightmare, would figure more and more clearly as time passed, as one of his outstanding achievements. And rarely had a president surrounded himself with such able, admirable men as Stimson, Burns, Marshall, Forrestal, Leahy, Atchison, Lovett, Eisenhower, Bradley, Clifford, Lilienthal, Harriman, Bolin, and Kennan, as time would also confirm. It was as distinguished a group as ever served the country, and importantly, he had supported them as they supported him. Born in the Gilded Age, the age of steam and gingerbread Gothic, Truman had lived to see a time of lost certainties and rocket trips to the moon. The arc of his life spanned more change in the world than in any prior period in history. A man of 19th century background, he had had to face many of the most difficult decisions of the unimaginably different 20th century. A son of rural inland America, raised only a generation removed from the frontier and imbued with the old Jeffersonian ideal of a rural democracy, he had had to assume command of the most powerful industrial nation on earth at the very moment when that power, in combination with stunning advances in science and technology, had become an unparalleled force in the world. The responsibilities he bore were like those of no other president before him, and he more than met the test. Ambitious by nature, he was never torn by ambition, never tried to appear as something he was not. He stood for common sense, common decency. He spoke the common tongue. As much as any president since Lincoln, he brought to the highest office the language and values of the common American people. He held to the old guidelines: work hard, do your best, speak the truth, assume no airs, trust in God, have no fear. Yet he was not and had never been a simple ordinary man. The homely attributes, the Missouri wit, the warmth of his friendship, the genuineness of Harry Truman, however appealing, were outweighed by the larger qualities that made him a figure of world stature, both a great and good man and a great American president. "Watch the president," Admiral King had whispered to Lord Moran at Potsdam. "This is all new to him, but he can take it. He is a more typical American than Roosevelt, and he will do a good job." With his ability to take it, his inner iron, his bedrock faith in the democratic process, his trust in the American people, and his belief that history was the final all-important judge of performance, he was truly exceptional. He never had a doubt about who he was, and that too was part of his strength, as well as the enjoyment of life he conveyed. He was the kind of president the Founding Fathers had in mind for the country. He came directly from the people. He was America. In his time, in his experience, from small town to farm to World War in far-off France in 1918, from financial failure after the war to the world of big city machine politics, to the revolutionary years of the New Deal in Washington, to the surge of American power during still another terrible World War, he had taken part in the great chronicle of American life as might have a character in a novel. There was something almost allegorical about it all, the man of independence and his odyssey. The lesson of Truman's life, said Senator Adlai E. Stevenson III of Illinois, was a lesson about ourselves, an object lesson in the vitality of popular government, an example of the ability of this society to yield up from the most unremarkable origins the most remarkable men. Dean Acheson had called him the captain with the mighty heart. George Marshall in 1948 had said it was the integrity of the man that would stand down the ages, more even than the courage of his decisions. Eric Sevareid, who observed at close range so much of the history of the era and its protagonists, would say nearly 40 years later of Truman, "I'm not sure he was right about the atomic bomb or even Korea, but remembering him reminds people what a man in that office ought to be like. It's character, just character. He stands like a rock in memory now. He had lived 88 years and not quite 8 months. Bess Truman lived on at 219 North Delaware for another 10 years. She died there on October 18th, 1982, and was buried beside him in the courtyard of the Truman Library. This concludes the reading of Truman by David McCullough. This book was read by Alexander Adams.